Chapter 8 of More William. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. More William by Richmal Crompton. Chapter 8. The May King. William was frankly bored. School always bored him. He disliked facts, and he disliked being tied down to detail, and he disliked answering questions. As a politician, a great future would have lain before him. William attended a mixed school because his parents hoped that feminine influence might have a mellowing effect upon his character. As yet, the mellowing was not apparent. He was roused from his daydreams by a change in the voice of Miss Dewhurst, his form mistress. It was evident that she was not talking about the exports of England, a subject in which William took little interest, any longer. "Children," she said brightly, "I want to have a little May Queen for the 1st of May. The rest of you may be her courtiers. I want you all to vote to-morrow. Put down on a piece of paper the name of the little girl you think would make the sweetest little queen, and the rest of you shall be her swains and maidens." "We're going to have a May Queen," remarked William to his family at dinner, "and I'm going to be a swain." His interest died down considerably when he discovered the meaning of the word swain. "Isn't it no sort of animal at all?" he asked indignantly. "Well, I'm not going to be in it then," he said when he heard that it was not. The next morning Evangeline Fish began to canvass for votes methodically. Evangeline Fish was very fair, and was dressed always in that shade of blue that shrieks aloud to the heavens and puts the skies to shame. She was considered the beauty of the form. "I'll give you 2 bull's-eyes if you'll vote for me," she said to William. "2?" said William with scorn. "6," she bargained. "All right," he said. "You can give me 6 bull's-eyes if you want. There's nothing to stop you giving me 6 bull's-eyes if you want, is there? Not that I know of." "But you'll have to promise to put down my name on the paper if I give you 6 bull's-eyes," she said suspiciously. "All right," said William. "I can easy promise that." Whereupon she handed over the 6 bull's-eyes. William returned one as being under regulation size, and waited frowning till she replaced it with a larger one. "Now you've promised," said Evangeline Fish. "They'll make you ill and die if you break your promise on 'em." William kept his promise with true political address. He wrote E. Fish, "I don't think," on his voting paper, and his vote was disqualified. But Evangeline Fish was elected May Queen by an overwhelming majority. She was, after all, the beauty of the form, and she always wore blue. And now she was to be the May Queen. Her prestige was established for ever. "Little angel," murmured the elder girls. The small boys fought for her favours. William began to dislike her intensely. Her voice, her smile, and her ringlets, and her blue dress began to jar upon his nerves. And when anything began to jar on William's nerves, something always happened. It was not till about a week later that he noticed Bettine Franklin. Bettine was small and dark. There was nothing angelic about her. William had noticed her vaguely in school before, and had hardly looked upon her as a distinct personality. But one recreation in the playground he stood leaning against the wall by himself, scowling at Evangeline Fish. She was surrounded by a crowd of admirers, and was prattling to them artlessly in her angelic voice. "I'm going to be dressed in white muslin with a blue sash. Blue suits me, you know. I'm so fair." She tossed back a ringlet. "One of you will have to hold my train, and the rest must dance round me. I'm going to have a crown, and—" She turned in order to avoid the scowling gaze of William in the distance. William had discovered that his scowl annoyed her, and since then he had given it little rest. But there was no satisfaction in scowling at the back of her well-curled head. So he relaxed his scowl and let his gaze wander round the playground, and it fell upon Bettine. Bettine was also standing by herself and gazing at Evangeline Fish, but she was not scowling. She was looking at Evangeline Fish with wistful envy. for Evangeline Fish was angelic and a May Queen, and she was neither of these things. William strolled over and lolled against the wall next to her. "Hello," he said, without looking at her, for his change of position had brought him again within range of Angeline Fish's eye, and he was once more simply one concentrated scowl. "Hello," murmured Bettine, shyly and politely. "You like pink rock?" was William's next effort. Said Bettine, nodding emphatically. "I'll give you some next time I buy some," said William munificently. "But I shan't be buying any for a long time," he added bitterly, "'cause an old ball slipped out of my hands onto our dining room window before I noticed it yesterday." She nodded understandingly. "I don't mind," she said sweetly. "I'll like you just as much if you don't give me any rock." William blushed. "I didn't know you liked me," he said. "I do," she said fervently. "I like your face and I like the things you say." William had forgotten to scowl. He was one flaming mixture of embarrassment and delight. He plunged his hands into his pockets and brought out 2 marbles, a piece of clay, and a broken toy gun. "You can have 'em all," he said in reckless generosity. "You keep them for me," said Bettine sweetly. "I hope you dance next to me at the Maypole when Evangeline's Queen. Won't it be lovely?" And she sighed. "Lovely!" exploded William. "Huh!" "Won't you like it?" said Bettine wonderingly. "Me?" exploded William again. "Dancing round a pole? Round that old girl?" "But she's so pretty." "No, she isn't," said William firmly. "She just isn't. Not much. I don't like her narsy shiny hair, and I don't like her narsy blue clothes, and I don't like her narsy face, and I don't like her narsy white shoes, nor her narsy necklaces, nor her narsy squeaky voice." He paused. Bettine drew a deep breath. "Do go on some more," she said. "I like listening to you." "Do you like her?" said William. "No. She's awful greedy. Did you know she was awful greedy?" "I can believe it," said William. "I can believe anything of anyone what talks in that squeaky voice."
"Just watch her when she's eating cakes. She goes on eating and eating and eating."
"She'll burst and die one day then," prophesied William solemnly, "and I shan't be sorry."
"But she'll look ever so beautiful when she's a May Queen."
"You'd look nicer," said William.
Bettine's small pale face flamed. "Oh no," she said.
"Would you like to be a May Queen?"
"Oh yes,"
she said. Said William, and returned to the discomfiture of Evangeline Fish by his steady, concentrated scowl. The next day he had the opportunity of watching her eating cakes. They met at the birthday party of a mutual classmate, and Evangeline Fish took her stand by the table and consumed cakes with a perseverance and determination worthy of a nobler cause. William accorded her a certain grudging admiration. Not once did she falter or faint. Iced cakes, cream cakes, pastries melted away before her, and never did she lose her ethereal, angelic appearance. Tight golden ringlets, blue eyes, faintly flushed cheeks, vivid pale blue dress remained immaculate and unruffled. And still she ate cakes. William watched her in amazement, forgetting even to scowl at her. Her capacity for cakes exceeded even William's, and his was no mean one. They had a rehearsal of the Maypole dance and crowning the next day.
"I want William Brown to hold the Queen's train," said Miss Dewhurst.
"Me?" ejaculated William in horror. "Do you mean me?"
"Yes, dear. It's a great honor to be asked to hold little Queen Evangeline's train. I'm sure you feel very proud. You must be her little courtier."
"Huh!" said William, transferring his scowl to Miss Dewhurst.
Evangeline beamed. She wanted William's admiration. William was the only boy in the form who was not her slave. She smiled at William sweetly.
"I'm not good at holdin' trains," said William. "I don't like holdin' trains. I've never been taught about holdin' trains. I might do it wrong on the day and spoil it all. I shan't like to spoil it all," he added virtuously.
"Oh, we'll have heaps of practices," said Miss Dewhurst brightly.
As he was going, Bettine pressed a small apple into his hand.
"A present for you," she murmured. "I saved it from my dinner."
He was touched. "I'll give you something to morrow," he said, adding hastily, "if I can find anything." They stood in silence till he had finished his apple. "I've left a lot on the core," he said in a tone of casual politeness, handing it to her. "Would you like to finish it?"
"No, thank you, William. You'll look so nice holding her train."
"I don't want to, and I bet I won't. You don't know the things I can do," he said darkly.
"Oh, William!"
She gasped in awe and admiration. "I'd hold your train if you was going to be Queen," he volunteered.
"I wouldn't want you to hold my train," she said earnestly. I'd want you to be May King with me."
"Yes, why don't they have May Kings?" said William, stung by this insult to his sex.
"Why shouldn't there be a May King?"
"'Spect they do, really, only perhaps Miss Dewhurst doesn't know about it." "Well, it doesn't make sense not having May Kings, does it? I wouldn't mind bein' May King if you was May Queen." The rehearsal was on the whole a failure.
"William Brown, don't hold the train so high. No, not quite so low. Don't stand so near the Queen, William Brown. No, not so far away. You'll pull the train off. Walk when the Queen walks, William Brown. Don't stand still. Sing up, please, train bearer. No, not quite so loud. That's deafening and not melodious."
In the end he was degraded from the position of train bearer to that of ordinary swain. The swains were dressed in smocks and the maidens in print dresses, and the maypole dance was to be performed round Evangeline Fish, who was to stand in queenly attire by the pole in the middle. All the village was to be invited. At the end of the rehearsal William came upon Bettine, once more gazing wistfully at Evangeline Fish, who was coquetting, with many tosses of the fair ringlets, before a crowd of admirers.
"Isn't it lovely for her to be May Queen?" said Bettine.
"She's a rotten one," said William. "I'm jolly glad I've not to hold up her rotten old train and listen to her narsy, squeaky voice singin' close to. And I'll give you a present to morrow." He did. He found a centipede in the garden and pressed it into her hand on the way to school. "They're jolly interestin'," he said. "Put in a matchbox and make holes for its breath, and it'll live ever so long. It won't bite you if you hold it the right way." And because she loved William, she took it without even a shudder. Evangeline Fish began to pursue William. She grudged him bitterly to Bettine. She pirouetted near him in her sky blue garments. She tossed her ringlets about him. She ogled him with her pale blue eyes. And in the long school hours during which he dreamed at his desk or played games with his friends, while highly paid instructors poured forth their wisdom for his benefit, William evolved a plan. Unfortunately, like most plans, it required capital, and William had no capital. Occasionally William's elder brother Robert would supply a few shillings without inconvenient questions, but it happened that Robert was ignoring William's existence at that time, for Robert had, not for the first time, discovered his ideal, and the ideal had been asked to lunch the previous week. For days Robert had made William's life miserable. He had objected to William's unbrushed hair and unmanicured hands and untidy person and noisy habits. He had bitterly demanded what she would think on being asked to a house where she might meet such an individual as William. He had insisted that William should be taught habits of cleanliness and silence before she came. He had hinted darkly that a man who had William for a brother was hampered considerably in his love affairs because she would think it was a queer kind of family where anyone like William was allowed to grow up. He had reserved some of his fervour for the cook. She must have a proper lunch, not stews and stuff they often had. There must be 3 vegetables and there must be cheese straws. Cook must learn to make better cheese straws, and William, having swallowed insults for 3 whole days, planned vengeance. It was a vengeance which only William could have planned or carried out, for only William could have seized a moment just before lunch, when the meal was dished up and the cook happened to be out of the kitchen, to carry the principal dishes down to the coal cellar and conceal them beneath the best nuts. It is well to draw a veil over the next half hour. Both William and the meal had vanished. Robert tore his hair and appealed vainly to the heavens. He hinted darkly at suicide. For what is cold tongue and coffee to offer up to an ideal? The meal was discovered during the afternoon in its resting place and given to William's mongrel, Jumble, who crept about during the next few days in agonies of indigestion. Robert had bitterly demanded of William why he went about the world spoiling people's lives and ruining their happiness. He had implied that when William met with the one and only love of his life, he need look for no help or assistance from him, Robert, because he, William, had dashed to the ground his, Robert's, cup of happiness, because he'd never in his life met anyone before like Miss Lang, and never would again, and he, William, had simply condemned him to a lonely and miserable old age, because who'd want to marry anyone that asked them to lunch and then gave them coffee and cold tongue? And he'd never want to marry anyone else, because it was the one and only love of his life. And he hoped that he, William, would realize, when he was old enough to realize, what it meant to have your life spoilt and your happiness ruined, all through coffee and tongue, because someone you'd never speak to again had hidden the lunch. Whence it came that William, optimist though he was, felt that any appeal to Robert for funds would be inopportune, to say the least of it. But Providence was on William's side for once. An old uncle came to tea and gave William 5 shillings. "Going to dance at a maypole, I hear," he chuckled. "P'raps," was all William said. His family were relieved by his meekness with regard to the May Day festival. Sometimes William made such a foolish fuss about being dressed up and performing in public. "You know, dear," said his mother, "it's a dear old festival and quite an honour to take part in it. And a smock is quite a nice manly garment." "Yes, mother," said William. The day was fine, a real May Day. The maypole was fixed up in the field near the school, and the little performers were to change in the schoolroom. William went out with his brown paper parcel of stage properties under his arm, and stood gazing up the road by which Evangeline Fish must come to the school, for Evangeline Fish would have to pass his gate. Soon he saw her, her pale blue radiant in the sun. "Hullo!" he greeted her. She simpered. She had won him at last. "Waiting to walk to school with me, William?" she said. He still loitered. "You're awfully early." "Am I? I thought I was late. I meant to be late. I don't want to be too early. I'm the most important person, and I want to walk in after the others. Then they'll all look at me." She tossed her tightly wrought curls. "Come into our old shed a minute," said William. "I've got a present for you." She blushed and ogled. "Oh, William!" she said, and followed him into the woodshed. "Look," he said. His uncle's 5 shillings had been well expended. Rows of cakes lay round the shed, pastries and sugar cakes and iced cakes and currant cakes. "Have a lot," said William. "They're all for you. Go on, eat 'em all. You can eat and eat and eat. There's lots and lots of time, and they can't begin without you, can they?" "Oh, William!" she said. She gloated over them. "Oh, may I?" "There's heaps of time," said William. "Go on, eat 'em all." Her greedy little eyes seemed to stand out of her head. "Oh!" she said in rapture. She sat down on the floor and began to eat, lost to everything but icing and currants and pastry. William made for the door. Then he paused, gazed wistfully at the feast, stepped back, and, grabbing a cream bun in each hand, crept quietly away. Bettine, in her print frock, was at the door of the school. "Hurry up," she said anxiously. "You're going to be late. The others are all out. They're waiting to begin. Miss Dewhurst's out there. They're all come but you and the Queen. I stayed because you asked me to stay to help you." He came in and shut the door. "You're going to be May Queen," he announced firmly. "Me?" she said in amazement. "Yes, and I'm going to be King." He unwrapped his parcel. "Look," he said. He had ransacked his sister's bedroom. Once Ethel had been to a fancy dress dance as a fairy. Over Bettine's print frock he drew a crumpled gauze slip with wings, torn in several places. On her brow he placed a tinsel crown at a rakish angle, and she quivered with happiness. "Oh, how lovely!" she said.
How lovely! How lovely!"
His own preparations were simpler. He tied a red sash that he had taken off his sister's hat over his right shoulder and under his left arm on the top of his smock. Someone had once given him a small bus conductor's cap with a toy set of tickets and clippers. He placed the cap upon his head with its peak over one eye. It was the only official headgear he had been able to procure. Then he took a piece of burnt cork from his parcel and solemnly drew a fierce and military moustache upon his cheek and lip. To William, no kind of theatricals was complete without a corked moustache. Then he took Bettine by the hand and led her out to the Maypole. The dancers were all waiting holding the ribbons. The audience was assembled, and a murmur of conversation was rising from it. It ceased abruptly as William and Bettine appeared. William's father, mother, and sister were in the front row. Robert was not there. Robert had declined to come to anything in which that little wretch was to perform. He'd jolly well had enough of that little wretch to last his lifetime. Thank you very much. William and Bettine stepped solemnly hand in hand upon the little platform which had been provided for the May Queen. Miss Dewhurst, who was chatting amicably to the parents till the last of her small performers should appear, seemed suddenly turned to stone, with mouth gaping and eyes wide. The old fiddler, who was rather short-sighted, struck up the strains, and the dancers began to dance. The audience relaxed, leaning back in their chairs to enjoy the scene. Miss Dewhurst was still frozen. There were murmured comments. How curious to have that boy there. A sort of attendant, I suppose. Yes, perhaps he's something allegorical. A sort of pageant. Good luck or something. It's not quite the sort of thing I expected, I must admit. What do you think of the Queen's dress? I always thought Miss Dewhurst had better taste. Rather tawdry, I call it. I think the moustache is a mistake. It gives quite a common look to the whole thing. I wonder who he's meant to be. Pan, do you think? Uncertainly. Oh, no. Nothing so pagan, I hope, said an elderly matron, horrified. He's that Brown boy, you know. There always seems to be something queer about anything he's in. I've noticed it often. But I hope he's meant to be something more Christian than Pan. Though one never knows in these days, she added darkly. William's sister had recognized her possessions and was gasping in anger. William's father, who knew William, was smiling sardonically. William's mother was smiling proudly. You're always running down William, she said to the world in general. But look at him now. He's got a very important part, and he said nothing about it at home. I call it very nice and modest of him. And what a dear little girl. Bettine, standing on the platform with William's hand holding hers and the Maypole dancers dancing round her, was radiant with pride and happiness. And Evangeline Fish, in the woodshed, was just beginning the last currant cake. End of Chapter 8. Read by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Chapter 9 of More William. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. More William by Richmal Crompton. Chapter 9. The Revenge. William was a scout. The fact was well known. There was no one within a 5-mile radius of William's home who did not know it. Sensitive old ladies had fled shuddering from their front doors when William marched down the street, singing, the word is a euphemism, his scout songs in his strong young voice. Curious smells emanated from the depth of the garden where William performed mysterious culinary operations. One old lady whose cat had disappeared looked at William with dour suspicion in her eye whenever he passed. Even the return of her cat a few weeks later did not remove the hostility from her gaze whenever it happened to rest upon William. William's family had welcomed the suggestion of William becoming a scout. It will keep him out of mischief, they'd said. They were notoriously optimistic where William was concerned. William's elder brother only was doubtful. You know what William is, he said. In that dark saying much was contained. Things went fairly smoothly for some time. He took the Scout's law of a daily deed of kindness in its most literal sense. He was to do one, and only one, deed of kindness a day. There were times when he forced complete strangers, much to their embarrassment, to be the unwilling recipients of his deed of kindness. There were times when he answered any demand for help with a cold, "No, I've done it to day." He received with saint-like patience the eloquence of his elder sister when she found her silk scarf tied into innumerable knots. "Well, they're jolly good knots," was all he said. He had been looking forward to the holidays for a long time. He was to go under canvas at the end of the first week. The first day of the holidays began badly. William's father had been disturbed by William, whose room was just above, and who had spent most of the night performing gymnastics as instructed by his scoutmaster. No, he didn't say do it at nights, but he said do it. He said it would make us grow up strong men. Don't you want me to grow up a strong man? He's ever so strong, and he did 'em. Why shouldn't I? His mother found a pan with the bottom burnt out, and at once accused William of the crime. William could not deny it. "Well, I was making something he told us, and I forgot it. Well, I've got to make things if I'm a scout. I didn't mean to forget it. I won't forget it next time. It's a rotten pan anyway, to burn itself into a hole just for that." At this point William's father received a note from a neighbour whose garden adjoined William's, and whose life had been rendered intolerable by William's efforts upon his bugle. The bugle was confiscated. Darkness descended upon William's soul. "Well," he muttered, "I'm going under canvas next week, and I'm jolly glad I'm going. P'raps you're going to be sorry when I'm gone." He went out into the garden and stood gazing moodily into space, his hands in the pocket of his short scout trousers, for William dressed on any and every occasion in his official costume. "Can't even have the bugle," he complained to the landscape. "Can't even use their rotten old pans. Can't tie knots in any of their old things. What's the good of being a scout?" His indignation grew, and with it a desire to be avenged upon his family. "I'd like to do something," he confided to a rose bush with a ferocious scowl. "Something just to show 'em." Then his face brightened. He had an idea. He'd get lost, get really lost, and they'd be sorry then, all right. They'd p'raps think he was dead, and they'd be sorry then, all right. He imagined their relief, their tearful apologies when at last he returned to the bosom of his family. It was worth trying, anyway. He set off cheerfully down the drive. He decided to stay away for lunch and tea and supper, and to return at dusk to a penitent, conscience-stricken family. He first made his way to a neighbouring wood, where he arranged a pile of twigs for a fire, but they refused to light, even with the aid of the match William had found adhering to a piece of putty in the recess of one of his pockets. Slightly dispirited, he turned his attention to his handkerchief and tied knots in it till it gave way under the strain. William's handkerchiefs being regularly used to perform the functions of blotting paper, among other duties not generally entrusted to handkerchiefs, were always in the last stages of decrepitude. He felt rather bored, and began to wonder whether it was lunch time or not. He then scouted the wood, and by his wood lore traced 3 distinct savage tribes' passage through the wood, and found the tracks of several elephants. He engaged in deadly warfare with about half a dozen lions, then tired of the sport. It must be about lunch time. He could imagine Ethel, his sister, hunting for him wildly high and low, with growing pangs of remorse. She'd wish she'd made less fuss over that old scarf. His mother would recall the scene over the pan, and her heart would fail her. His father would think with shame of his conduct in the matter of the bugle. Poor William! How cruel we were! How different we shall be if only he comes home! He could almost hear the words. Perhaps his mother was weeping now. His father, wild-eyed and white-lipped, was pacing his study, waiting for news, eager to atone for his unkindness to his missing son. Perhaps he had the bugle on the table, ready to give back to him. Perhaps he'd even bought him a new one. He imagined the scene of his return. He would be nobly forgiving. He would accept the gift of the new bugle without a word of reproach. His heart thrilled at the thought of it. He was getting jolly hungry. It must be after lunch time, but it would spoil it all to go home too early. Here he caught sight of a minute figure regarding him with a steady gaze and holding a paper bag in one hand. William stared down at him. "What are you dressed up like that for?" said the apparition, with a touch of scorn in his voice. William looked down at his sacred uniform and scowled. "I'm a scout," he said loftily. "Cout?" repeated the apparition with an air of polite boredom. "What's your name?" "William." "Mine's Thomas." "Will you catch me a wops? Look at my wopses." He opened the bag slightly, and William caught sight of a crowd of wasps buzzing about inside the bag. "Want more?" demanded the infant. "Want lots more. Look, snells." He brought out a handful of snails from a miniature pocket and put them on the ground. "Watch 'em put their horns out. Watch 'em walk. Look, they're walking. They're walking." His voice was a scream of ecstasy. He took them up and returned them to their pocket. From another he drew out a wriggling mass. "Woodlice," he explained casually. "Got worms in another pocket." He returned the woodlice to his pocket, except one, which he held between a finger and thumb, laid thoughtfully against his lip. "Want wopses now. You get 'em for me." William roused himself from his bewilderment. How do you catch 'em?" he said. "Wings," replied Thomas. "Get hold of their wings and they don't sting. Sometimes they do, though," he added casually. "Then your hands go big." A wasp settled near him, and very neatly the young naturalist picked him up and put him in his paper prison. "Now you get one," he ordered William. William determined not to be outdone by this minute but dauntless stranger. As a wasp obligingly settled on a flower near him, he put out his hand, only to withdraw it with a yell of pain and apply it to his mouth. "Ow!" he said. "Crumbs!" Thomas emitted a peal of laughter. "You stung?" he said. "Did it sting you? Funny!" William's expression of rage and pain was exquisite to him. "Come on, boy," he ordered at last. "Let's go somewhere else." William's bewildered dignity made a last stand. "You can go," he said. "I'm playin' by myself." "All right," agreed Thomas. "You play by yourself and me play by myself, and we'll be together playin' by ourselves." He set off down a path, and meekly William followed. It must be jolly late, almost tea time. "I'm hungry," said Thomas suddenly. "Give me some breakfast." "I haven't got any," said William irritably. "Well, find some," persisted the infant. "I can't. There isn't any to find." "Well, buy some." "I haven't got any money." "Well, buy some money." Goaded, William turned on him. "Go away!" he bellowed. Thomas's blue eyes, beneath a mop of curls, met his coldly. "Don't talk so loud," he said sternly. "There's some blackberries there. You can get me some blackberries." William began to walk away, but Thomas trotted by his side. "There," he persisted. "Just where I'm pointing. Lovely big, huge ones. Get 'em for my breakfast." Reluctantly the scout turned to perform his deed of kindness. Thomas consumed blackberries faster than William could gather them. "Up there," he commanded. "No, the one right up there I want. I want it. Kick! I've eaten all the others." William was scratched and breathless. His shirt was torn when at last the rapacious Thomas was satisfied. Then he partook of a little refreshment himself, while Thomas turned out his pockets. "I'll let 'em go now," he said. One of his woodlice, however, remained motionless where he put it. "What's the matter with it?" said William curiously. "I s'pect me's the matter with it," said Thomas succinctly. "Now get me some little fishes and tadpoles and water sings," he went on cheerfully. William turned round from his blackberry bush. "Well, I won't," he said decidedly. "I've had enough." "You've had enough breakfast," said Thomas sternly. "I've found a little tin for the sings, so be quick. Oh, here's a fly.
A green fly. It's sitting on my finger. Does it like me 'cause it's sitting on my finger?"
"No," said William, turning a purple-stained countenance round scornfully. It must be nearly night. He didn't want to be too hard on them, to make his mother ill or anything. He wanted to be as kind as possible. He'd forgive them at once when he got home. He'd ask for one or two things he wanted, as well as the new bugle, a new penknife, and an engine with a real boiler.
"What for does it not like me?"
persisted Thomas. William was silent. Question and questioner were beneath contempt.
"What for does it not like me?"
he shouted stridently. "Flies don't like people, silly."
"What for not?" retorted Thomas.
"They don't know anything about them."
"Well, I'll tell it about me. My name's Thomas," he said to the fly politely. "Now does it like me?"
William groaned, but the fly had now vanished, and Thomas once more grew impatient.
"Come on," he said. "Come and find things for me."
William's manly spirit was by this time so far broken that he followed his new acquaintance to a neighbouring pond, growling threateningly but impotently.
"Now," commanded his small tyrant, "take off your boots and stockings and go and find things for me."
"Take off yours," growled William, "and find things for yourself."
"No," said Thomas. "Crocodiles might be there and bite my toes, and pittopotamuses might be there. If you don't go in, I'll scream and scream and scream."
William went in. He walked gingerly about the muddy pond. Thomas watched him critically from the bank.
"I don't like your hair,"
he said confidingly. William growled. He caught various small swimming objects in the tin and brought them to the bank for inspection.
"I want more'n that,"
said Thomas calmly. "Well, you won't get it," retorted William. He began to put on his boots and stockings, wondering desperately how to rid himself of his unwanted companion. But fate solved the problem. With a loud cry, a woman came running down the path.
"Tommy," she said. "My little darling Tommy, I thought you were lost."
She turned furiously to William.
"You ought to be ashamed of yourself," she said. "A great boy of your age leading a little child like this into mischief. If his father was here, he'd show you. You ought to know better, and you a scout."
William gasped. "Well," he said, "and I've been doing deeds of kindness on him all morning. I've " She turned away indignantly, holding Thomas's hand.
"You're never to go with that nasty rough boy again, darling," she said. "Got lots of wopses and some fishes," murmured Thomas contentedly.
They disappeared down the path. With a feeling of depression and disillusionment, William turned to go home. Then his spirits rose. After all, he'd got rid of Thomas, and he was going home to a contrite family. It must be about supper time. It would be getting dark soon. But it still stayed light a long time now. It wouldn't matter if he just got in for supper. It would have given them time to think things over. He could see his father speaking unsteadily and holding out his hand. "My boy, let bygones be bygones. If there's anything you want." His father had never said anything of this sort to him yet, but by a violent stretch of imagination he could just conceive it. His mother, of course, would cry over him, and so would Ethel.
"Dear William, do forgive us. We've been so miserable since you went away. We will never treat you so again."
This again was unlike the Ethel he knew, but sorrow has a refining effect on all characters. He entered the gate self-consciously. Ethel was at the front door. She looked at his torn shirt and mud-caked knees.
"You'd better hurry if you're going to be ready for lunch," she said coldly.
"Lunch?" faltered William. "What time is it?"
10 to 1. Father's in, so I warn you," she added unpleasantly.
He entered the house in a dazed fashion. His mother was in the hall.
"William," she said impatiently, "another shirt torn? You really are careless. You'll have to stop being a scout if that's the way you treat your clothes. And look at your knees."
Pale and speechless, he went towards the stairs. His father was coming out of the library smoking a pipe. He looked at his son grimly. "If you aren't downstairs cleaned by the time the lunch bell goes, my son," he said, You won't see that bugle of yours this side of Christmas." William swallowed. "Yes, father," he said meekly.
He went upstairs to the bathroom.
Life was a rotten show. End of Chapter 9. The Revenge. Read by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Chapter 10 of More William. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barbara Bulkley of BigBible.org. More William by Richmal Crompton. Chapter 10. The Helper. The excitement began at breakfast. William descended late, and after receiving his parents' reproaches with an air of weary boredom, ate his porridge listlessly. He had come to the conclusion that morning that there was a certain monotonous sameness about life. One got up and had one's breakfast, and went to school, and had one's dinner, and went to school, and had one's tea, and played, and had one's supper, and went to bed. Even the fact that today was a half-term holiday did not dispel his depression. 1 day's holiday. What good was 1 day? We have all experienced such feelings. Half abstractedly he began to listen to his elders' conversation. "They promised to be here by 9, his mother was saying. "I do hope they won't be late." "Well, it's not much good their coming if the other house isn't ready, is it?" said William's grown-up sister Ethel. "I don't believe they've even finished painting." "I'm so sorry it's William's half-term holiday," sighed Mrs. Brown. "He'll be frightfully in the way." William's outlook on life brightened considerably. "They're coming removing this morning?" he inquired cheerfully. "Yes, do try not to hinder them, William." "Me?" he said indignantly. "I'm going to help." "If William's going to help," remarked his father, "thank heaven I shan't be here. Your assistance, William, always seems to be even more devastating in its results than your opposition." William smiled politely. Sarcasm was always wasted on William. "Well," he said, rising from the table, "I'd better go and be getting ready to help." 10 minutes later, Mrs. Brown, coming out of the kitchen from her interview with the cook, found to her amazement that the steps of the front door were covered with small ornaments. As she stood staring, William appeared from the drawing-room, staggering under the weight of a priceless little statuette that had been the property of Mr. Brown's great-grandfather. "William!" she gasped. "I'm getting all the little things ready for him, just to carry straight down. If I put everything on the steps, they don't need come into the house at all. You said you didn't want 'em tramping in dirty boots." It took a quarter of an hour to replace them. Over the fragments of a blue delf bowl, Mrs. Brown sighed deeply. "I wish you'd broken anything but this, William." "Well," he excused himself, "you said things do get broken removing. You said so yourself. I didn't break it on purpose, it just got broken removing." At this point the removers arrived. There were 3 of them. One was very fat and jovial, and one was thin and harassed-looking, and a third wore a sheepish smile and walked with a slightly unsteady gait. They made profuse apologies for their lateness. "You'd better begin with the dining-room," said Mrs. Brown. "Will you pack the china first? William, get out of the way." She left them packing, assisted by William. William carried the things to them from the sideboard cupboards. "What's your names?" he asked, as he stumbled over a glass bowl that he had inadvertently left on the hearth-rug. His progress was further delayed while he conscientiously picked up the fragments. "Things do get broken removing," he murmured. "Mine is Mr. Blake, and is Mr. Johnson, and is Mr. Jones." "Which is Mr. Jones? The one that walks funny?" They shook with Herculean laughter, so much so that a china cream jug slipped from Mr. Blake's fingers and lay in innumerable pieces round his boot. He kicked it carelessly aside. "Yus," he said, bending anew to his task. "'Im what walks funny." "Why's he walk funny?" persisted William. "Has he hurt his legs?" "Yus," said Blake with a wink. "'E 'urt 'em at the Blue Cow comin' here." Mr. Jones' sheepish smile broadened into a guffaw. "Well, you rest," said William sympathetically. "You lie down on the sofa and rest. I'll help, so's you needn't do anything." Mr. Jones grew hilarious. "Come on," he said. My eye, this young gent's all right, he is. You lie down and rest, he says. Well, here goes." To the huge delight of his companions, he stretched himself at length upon the Chesterfield and closed his eyes. William surveyed him with pleasure. "That's right," he said. I'll show you my dog when your legs are better. I've got a fine dog." "What sort of a dog?" said Mr. Blake, resting from his labours to ask the question. "He's no particular sort of dog," said William honestly, "but he's a jolly fine dog. You should see him do tricks." "Well, let's have a look at him. Fetch him, Art." William, highly delighted, complied, and Jumble showed off his best tricks to an appreciative audience of two. Mr. Jones had already succumbed to the drowsiness that had long been creeping over him, and was lying dead to the world on the Chesterfield. Jumble begged for a biscuit. He walked. Perforce, for William's hand firmly imprisoned his front ones, on his hind legs, he leapt over William's arm. He leapt into the very centre of an old Venetian glass that was on the floor by the packing case, and cut his foot slightly on a piece of it, but fortunately suffered no ill effects. William saw consternation on Mr. Johnson's face, and hastened to gather the pieces and fling them lightly into the waste paper basket. "It's all right," he said soothingly. "She said things get broken removing." When Mrs. Brown entered the room 10 minutes later, Mr. Jones was still asleep, Jumble was still performing, and Messrs. Blake and Johnson were standing in negligent attitudes against the wall, appraising the eager Jumble with sportsmanlike eyes. "He's no breed," Mr. Blake was saying, "but he's all right. I'd like to see him after a rat. I bet he'd—" Seeing Mrs. Brown, he hastily seized a vase from the mantelpiece and carried it over to the packing case, where he appeared suddenly to be working against time. Mr. Johnson followed his example. Mrs. Brown's eyes fell upon Mr. Jones, and she gasped. "Whatever?" she began. "He's not very well, him," explained Mr. Blake obsequiously. "He'll be all right when he's slept it orf. He's always all right when he's slept it orf." "He's hurt his legs," explained William. "He hurt his legs at the Blue Cow. He's just resting." Mrs. Brown swallowed and counted 20 to herself. It was a practice she had acquired in her youth for use in times when words crowded upon her too thick and fast for utterance. At last she spoke with unusual bitterness. "Need he rest with his muddy boots on my Chesterfield?" At this point Mr. Jones awoke from sleep, hypnotized out of it by her cold eye. He was profuse in his apologies. He believed he had fainted. He had had a bad headache, brought on probably by exposure to the early morning sun. He felt much better after his faint. He regretted having fainted onto the ladies' sofa. He partially brushed off the traces of his dirty boots with an equally dirty hand. "You've done nothing in this room," said Mrs. Brown. "We shall never get finished. William, come away. I'm sure you're hindering them." "Me?" said William in righteous indignation. "Me? I'm helping." After what seemed to Mrs. Brown to be several hours, they began on the heavy furniture. They staggered out with the dining-room sideboard, carrying away part of the staircase with it in transit. Mrs. Brown, with a paling face, saw her beloved antique cabinet dismembered against the doorpost, and watched her favourite collapsible card table perform a thorough and permanent collapse. Even the hat stand from the hall was devoid of some pegs when it finally reached the van. "This is simply breaking my heart," moaned Mrs. Brown. "Where's William?" said Ethel gloomily, looking round. "Shh! I don't know. He disappeared a few minutes ago. I don't know where he is. I only hope he'll stay there." The removers now proceeded to the drawing-room and prepared to take out the piano. They tried it every way. The first way took a piece out of the doorpost. The second made a dint 2 inches deep in the piano. The third knocked over the grandfather clock, which fell with a resounding crash, breaking its glass and, incidentally, a tall china plant stand that happened to be in its line of descent. Mrs. Brown sat down and covered her face with her hands. "It's like some dreadful nightmare," she groaned. Messrs. Blake, Johnson and Jones paused to wipe the sweat of honest toil from their brows. "I dunno how it's to be got out," said Mr. Blake despairingly. "It got in," persisted Mrs. Brown. "If it got in, it can get out." "We'll have another try," said Mr. Blake, with the air of a hero leading a forlorn hope. "Come on, mates." This time was successful, and the piano passed safely into the hall, leaving in its wake only a dislocated door handle and a torn chair cover. It then passed slowly and devastatingly down the hall and drive. The next difficulty was to get it into the van. Messrs. Blake, Johnson and Jones tried alone and failed. For 10 minutes they tried alone and failed. Between each attempt they paused to mop their brows and throw longing glances towards the Blue Cow, whose signboard was visible down the road. The gardener, the cook, the housemaid and Ethel all gave their assistance, and at last, with a superhuman effort, they raised it to the van. They then all rested weakly against the nearest support and gasped for breath. "Well," said Mr. Jones, looking reproachfully at the mistress of the house, "I've never handled a piano." At this moment a well-known voice was heard in the recesses of the van, behind the piano and sideboard and hat-stand. "Hey, let me out! What you've gone blocking up the van for? I can't get out." There was a horror-stricken silence. Then Ethel said sharply, "What did you go in for?" The mysterious voice came again with a note of irritability. "Well, I was resting. I must have some rest, mustn't I? I've been helping all morning." "Well, couldn't you see we were putting things in?" The unseen presence spoke again. "No, I can't. I wasn't looking." "You can't get out, William," said Mrs. Brown desperately. "We can't move everything again. You must just stop there till it's unpacked. We'll try to push your lunch into you." There was determination in the voice that answered, "I want to get out. I'm going to get out." There came tumultuous sounds, the sound of the ripping of some material, of the smashing of glass, and of William's voice softly ejaculating, "Crumbs! That old looking glass getting in the way." "You'd better take the piano out again," said Mrs. Brown wanly. "It's the only thing to do." With straining and efforts and groans and a certain amount of destruction, the piano was eventually lowered again to the ground. Then the sideboard and hat-stand were moved to one side, and finally there emerged from the struggle William and Jumble. Jumble's coat was covered with little pieces of horsehair, as though from the interior of a chair. William's jersey was torn from shoulder to hem. He looked stern and indignant. "A nice thing to do," he began bitterly, "shutting me up in that old van. How do you expect me to breathe shut in with old bits of furniture? Folks can't live without air, can they? A nice thing if you'd find me dead." Emotion had deprived his audience of speech for the time being. With a certain amount of dignity he walked past them into the house, followed by Jumble. It took another quarter of an hour to replace the piano. As they were making the final effort, William came out of the house. "Here, I'll help," he said, and laid a finger on the side. His presence rather hindered their efforts, but they succeeded in spite of it. William, however, was under the impression that his strength alone had wrought the miracle. He put on an outrageous swagger. "I'm jolly strong," he confided to Mr. Blake. "I'm stronger than most folk." Here the removers decided that it was time for their midday repast and retired to consume it in the shady back garden. All except Mr. Jones, who said he would go down the road for a drink of lemonade. William said that there was lemonade in the larder and offered to fetch it, but Mr. Jones said hastily that he wanted a special sort. He had to be very particular what sort of lemonade he drank. Mrs. Brown and Ethel sat down to a scratch meal in the library. William followed his two new friends wistfully into the garden. "William, come to lunch," called Mrs. Brown. "Oh, leave him alone, mother," pleaded Ethel. "Let us have a little peace." But William did not absent himself for long. "I want a red handkerchief," he demanded loudly from the hall. There was no response. He appeared in the doorway. "I say, I want a red handkerchief. Have you got a red handkerchief, mother?" "No, dear." "Have you, Ethel?" "No." "All right," said William aggrievedly. "You needn't get mad, need you? I'm only asking for a red handkerchief. I don't want a red handkerchief off you if you haven't got it, do I? William, go away and shut the door." William obeyed. Peace reigned throughout the house and garden for the next half hour. Then Mrs. Brown's conscience began to prick her. "William must have something to eat, dear. Do go and find him." Ethel went out to the back garden. A scene of happy restfulness met her gaze. Mr. Blake reclined against one tree, consuming bread and cheese, while a red handkerchief covered his knees. Mr. Johnson reclined against another tree, also consuming bread and cheese, while a red handkerchief covered his knees. William leant against a third tree, consuming a little heap of scraps collected from the larder, while on his knees also reposed what was apparently a red handkerchief. Jumble sat in the middle, catching with nimble, snapping jaws dainties flung to him from time to time by his circle of admirers. Ethel advanced nearer and inspected William's red handkerchief with dawning horror in her face. Then she gave a scream. "William, that's my silk scarf! It was for a hat. I've only just bought it. Oh, Mother, do something to William. He's taken my new silk scarf, the one I'd got to trim my leghorn. He's the most awful boy. I don't think—" Mrs. Brown came out hastily to pacify her. William handed the silk scarf back to its rightful owner. "Well, I'm sorry. I thought it was a red handkerchief. It looked like a red handkerchief. Well, how could I know it wasn't a red handkerchief? I've given it her back. All right, Jumble's only bit one end of it, and that's only jam what dropped on it. Well, it'll wash, won't it? Well, I've said I'm sorry." "I don't get much thanks," William continued bitterly. "Me giving up my half-holiday to helping you removing, and I don't get much thanks." "Well, William," said Mrs. Brown, "you can go to the new house with the first van. He'll be less in the way there," she confided distractedly to the world in general. William was delighted with this proposal. At the new house there was a fresh set of men to unload the van, and there was a thrill of making their acquaintance. Then the front gate was only just painted and bore a notice, "Wet paint." It was, of course, incumbent upon William to test personally the wetness of the paint. His trousers bore testimony to the testing to their last day, in spite of many applications of turpentine. Jumble also tested it, and had in fact to be disconnected with the front gate by means of a pair of scissors. For many weeks the first thing that visitors to the Brown household saw was a little tuft of Jumble's hair adorning the front gate. William then proceeded to help to the utmost of his power. He stumbled up from the van to the house, staggering under the weight of a medicine cupboard, and leaving a trail of broken bottles and little pools of medicine behind. Jumble sampled many of the latter, and became somewhat thoughtful. It was found that the door of a small bedroom at the top of the stairs was locked, and this fact, added to Mr. Jones's failure to return from his lemonade, rather impeded the progress of the unpackers. "Break it open," suggested one. "Better not." "Perhaps the key's inside," suggested another brightly. William had one of his brilliant ideas. "Tell you what I'll do," he said eagerly and importantly. "I'll climb up to the roof and get down the chimney and open it from the inside." They greeted the proposal with guffaws. They did not know William. It was growing dusk when Mrs. Brown and Ethel and the second van load appeared. "What is that on the gate?" said Ethel, stooping to examine the part of Jumble's coat that brightened up the dullness of the black paint. "It's that dog," she said. Then came a ghost-like cry, apparently from the heavens. "Mother!" Mrs. Brown raised a startled countenance to the skies. There seemed to be nothing in the skies that could have addressed her. Then she suddenly saw a small face peering down over the coping of the roof. It was a face that was very frightened under a superficial covering of soot. It was William's face. "I can't get down," it said hoarsely. Mrs. Brown's heart stood still. "Stay where you are, William," she said faintly. "Don't move." The entire staff of removers was summoned. A ladder was borrowed from a neighbouring garden and found to be too short. Another was fetched and fastened to it. William, at his dizzy height, was growing irritable. "I can't stay up here for ever," he said severely. At last he was rescued by his friend Mr. Blake and brought down to safety. His account was confused. "I wanted to help. I wanted to open that door for him, so I climbed up by the scullery roof and the ivy and the drain pipe, and I tried to get down the chimney. I didn't know which one it was, but I tried 'em all, and they were all too little, and I tried to get down by the ivy again, but I couldn't, so I waited till you came and hollered out. I wasn't scared," he said, fixing them with a stern eye. "I wasn't scared a bit. I just wanted to get down, and this old black chimney stuff tastes beastly. No, I'm all right," he ended, in answer to tender inquiries. "I'll go on helping." He was with difficulty persuaded to retire to bed at a slightly earlier hour than usual. "Well," he confessed, "I'm a bit tired with helping all day." Soon after he had gone, Mr. Brown and Robert arrived. "And how have things gone today?" said Mr. Brown cheerfully. "Thank heaven William goes to school tomorrow," said Ethel devoutly. Upstairs in his room, William was studying himself in the glass. Torn jersey, paint-stained trousers, blackened face. "Well," he said with a deep sigh of satisfaction, "I guess I've jolly well helped today." End of chapter 10. The Helper, read by Barbara Bulkley of BigBible.org.
More William by Richmal Crompton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Chapter 11. William and the Smuggler. William's family were going to the seaside for February. It was not an ideal month for the seaside, but William's father's doctor had ordered him a complete rest and change. "We shall have to take William with us, you know," his wife had said as they discussed plans. "Good heavens!" groaned Mr. Brown. "I thought it was meant to be a rest cure." "Yes, but you know what he is," his wife urged. "I daren't leave him with anyone. Certainly not with Ethel. We shall have to take them both. Ethel will help with him." Ethel was William's grown-up sister. "All right," her husband agreed finally. "You can take all responsibility. I formally disown him from now till we get back. I don't care what trouble he lands you in. You know what he is, and you deliberately take him away with me on a rest cure." "It can't be helped, dear," said his wife mildly. William was thrilled by the news. It was several years since he had been at the seaside. "Will I be able to go swimming?" "It won't be too cold." "Well, if I wrap up warm, will I be able to go swimming?" "Can I catch fishes?" "Are there lots of smugglers smuggling there?" "Well, I'm only asking. You needn't get mad." One afternoon Mrs. Brown missed her best silver tray and searched the house high and low for it wildly, while dark suspicions of each servant in turn arose in her usually unsuspicious breast. It was finally discovered in the garden. William had dug a large hole in one of the garden beds. Into the bottom of this he had fitted a tray and had lined the sides with bricks. He had then filled it with water, and, taking off his shoes and stockings, stepped up and down his narrow pool. He was distinctly aggrieved by Mrs. Brown's reproaches. "Well, I was practising paddling, ready for going to the seaside. I didn't mean to ruin your tray. You talk as if I meant to ruin your tray. I was only practising paddling." At last the day of departure arrived. William was instructed to put his things ready on his bed, and his mother would then come and pack for him. He summoned her proudly over the balusters after about 20 minutes. "I've got everything ready, mother." Mrs. Brown ascended to his room. Upon his bed was a large pop-gun, a football, a dormouse in a cage, a punch-ball on a stand, a large box of curios, and a buckskin, which was his dearest possession and had been presented to him by an uncle from South Africa. Mrs. Brown sat down weakly on a chair. "You can't possibly take any of these things," she said, faintly but firmly. "Well, you said put my things on the bed for you to pack, and I've put 'em on the bed. And now you say—" "I meant clothes." "Oh, clothes!" he said scornfully. "I never thought of clothes." "Well, you can't take any of these things anyway." William hastily began to defend his collection of treasures. "I must have the pop-gun, because you never know. There may be pirates and smugglers down there, and you can kill a man with a pop-gun if you get near enough and know the right place, and I might need it. And I must have the football to play on the sands with, and the punch-ball to practise boxing on, and I must have the dormouse, 'cause to feed him, and I must have this box of things, and this skin to show folks I meet down at the seaside, 'cause they're interesting." But Mrs. Brown was firm, and William reluctantly yielded. In a moment of weakness, finding that his trunk was only 3/4 filled by his things, she slipped in his beloved buckskin, while William himself put the pop-gun inside when no one was looking. They had been unable to obtain a furnished house, so had to be content with a boarding-house. Mr. Brown was eloquent on the subject. "If you're deliberately turning that child loose into a boarding-house full, presumably, of quiet, inoffensive people, you deserve all you get. It's nothing to do with me. I'm going to have a rest cure. I've disowned him. He can do as he likes." "It can't be helped, dear," said Mrs. Brown mildly. Mr. Brown had engaged one of the huts on the beach, chiefly for William's use, and William proudly furnished its floor with the buckskin. "It was killed by my uncle. he announced to the small crowd of children at the door, who had watched with interest his painstaking measuring of the floor in order to place his treasure in the exact centre. "He killed it dead, just like this." William had never heard the story of the death of the buck, and therefore had invented one, in which he had gradually come to confuse himself with his uncle in the role of hero. "I was walkin' about, and he met it. I hadn't got a gun, and it sprung on me, and I caught hold of its neck with one hand, and I broke off its horns with the other, and I knocked it over, and it got up and ran at him again, and I just tripped it up with my foot, and it fell over again, and then I just give it one big hit with my right fist on its head, and it killed it, and it died." There was an incredulous gasp. Then came a clear, high voice from behind the crowd. "Little boy, you are not telling the truth." William looked up into a thin, spectacled face. "I wasn't telling it to you," he remarked, wholly unabashed. A little girl with dark curls took up the cudgels quite needlessly in William's defence. "He's a very brave boy to do all that," she said indignantly. "So don't you go saying things to him." "Well," said William, flattered but modest, "I didn't say I did it, did I? I said my uncle. Well, partly my uncle." Mr. Percival Jones looked down at him in righteous wrath. "You're a very wicked little boy. I'll tell your father. I'll tell your sister." For Ethel was approaching in the distance, and Mr. Percival Jones was in no way loath to converse with her. Mr. Percival Jones was a thin, pale, aesthetic would-be poet who lived and thrived on the admiration of the elderly ladies of his boarding-house, and had done so for the past 10 years. Once he had published a volume of poems at his own expense. He lived at the same boarding-house as the Browns, and had seen Ethel in the distance to meals. He had admired the red lights in her dark hair and the blue of her eyes, and had even gone so far as to wonder whether she possessed the solid and enduring qualities which he would require of one whom in his mind he referred to as his future spouse. He began to walk down the beach with her. "I should like to speak to you about your brother, Miss Brown," he began, "if you can spare me the time. Of course, I trust I do not intrude or presume. He is a charming little man, but I fear not voracious. May I accompany you on your way? I am much attracted to your family. I should like to know you all better. I am deeply attached to your little brother, but grieved to find that he does not adhere to the truth in his statements. Miss Brown's blue eyes were dancing with merriment. "Oh, don't you worry about William," she said. "He's awful. It's much best just to leave him alone. Isn't the sea gorgeous to-day?" They walked along the sands. Meanwhile, William had invited his small defender into his hut. "You can look round," he said graciously. "You've seen my skin, what he killed, haven't you? This is my gun. You put a cork in there, and it comes out hard when you shoot it. It would kill anyone," impressively, "if you did it near enough to them, and at the right place. And I've got a dormouse and a punch ball and a box of things and a football, but they wouldn't let me bring them," bitterly. "It's a lovely skin," said the little girl. "What's your name?" "William. What's yours?" "Peggy." "Well, let's be on a desert island, shall we? And nothing to eat nor anything, shall we? Come on." She nodded eagerly. "How lovely!" They wandered out onto the promenade, and among a large crowd of passers-by bemoaned the lone emptiness of the island and scanned the horizon for a sail. In the far distance on the cliffs could be seen the figures of Mr. Percival Jones and William's sister walking slowly away from the town. At last they turned towards the hut. "We must find something to eat," said William firmly. "We can't let ourselves starve to death." "Shrimps?" suggested Peggy cheerfully. "We haven't got nets," said William. "We couldn't save them from the wreck." "Periwinkles?" "There aren't any on this island. I know, seaweed, and we'll cook it." "Oh, how lovely!" He gathered up a handful of seaweed, and they entered the hut, leaving a white handkerchief tied to the door to attract the attention of any passing ship. The hut was provided with a gas ring, and William, disregarding his family's express injunction, lit this and put on a saucepan filled with water and seaweed. "We'll pretend it's a wood fire," he said. "We couldn't make a real wood fire out on the prom. They'd stop us. So we'll pretend this is, and we'll pretend we saved a saucepan from the wreck." After a few minutes he took off the pan and drew out a long green strand. "You eat it first," he said politely. The smell of it was not pleasant. Peggy drew back. "Oh, no, you first." No, you," said William nobly. "You look hungrier than me." She bit off a piece, chewed it, shut her eyes, and swallowed. "Now you," she said, with a shade of vindictiveness in her voice. "You're not going to not have any." William took a mouthful and shivered. "I think it's gone bad," he said critically. Peggy's rosy face had paled. "I'm going home," she said suddenly. "You can't go home on a desert island," said William severely. "Well, I'm going to be rescued then," she said. "I think I am too," said William. It was lunch time when William arrived at the boarding house. Mr. Percival Jones had moved his place to be nearer Ethel. He was now convinced that she possessed of every virtue his future spouse could need. He conversed brightly and incessantly during the meal. Mr. Brown grew restive. "The man will drive me mad," he said afterwards, "bleating away. What's he bleating about anyway? Can't you stop him bleating, Ethel? You seem to have influence. Bleat, bleat, bleat. Good Lord, and me here for a rest cure." At this point he was summoned to the telephone and returned distraught. "It's an unknown female," he said. "She says that a boy of the name of William from this boarding house has made her little girl sick by forcing her to eat seaweed. She says it's brutal. Does anyone know I'm here for a rest cure? Where is the boy? Good heavens, where is the boy?" But William, like Peggy, had retired from the world for a space. He returned later on in the afternoon, looking pale and chastened. He bore the reproaches of his family in stately silence. Mr. Percival Jones was in great evidence in the drawing-room. "And soon the spring will be with us once more," he was saying in his high-pitched voice as he leaned back in his chair and joined the tips of his fingers together. "The spring, the spring. I have a little effort I composed on the coming of spring. I will read it to you sometime if you will be kind enough to criticize impartially." "Criticize?" they chorused. "It will be above criticism. Oh, do read it to us, Mr. Jones." "I will this evening." His eyes wandered to the door, hoping and longing for his beloved's entrance. But Ethel was with her father at a matinee in the Winter Gardens, and he looked and longed in vain. In spite of this, however, the springs of his eloquence did not run dry, and he held forth ceaselessly to his little circle of admirers. "The simple pleasures of nature. How few of us, alas, have the gift of appreciating them rightly. This little seaside hamlet, with its sea, its promenade, its Winter Gardens. How beautiful it is. How few appreciate it rightly." Here William entered, and Mr. Percival Jones broke off abruptly. He disliked William. "Here comes our little friend. He looks pale. Remorse, my young friend? Beware of untruthfulness. Beware of the beginnings of a life of lies and deception." He laid a hand on William's head, and cold shivers ran down William's spine. "Be good, sweet child, and let who will be clever, as the poet says." There was murder in William's heart. At that minute Ethel entered. "No," she snapped. "I sat next to a man who smelt of bad tobacco. I hate men who smoke bad tobacco." Mr. Jones assumed an expression of intense piety. "I may boast," he said sanctimoniously, "that I have never thus soiled my lips with drink or smoke." There was an approving murmur from the occupants of the drawing-room. William had met his father in the passage outside the drawing-room. Mr. Brown was wearing a hunted expression. "Can I go into the drawing-room?" he said bitterly. "Or is he bleating away in there?" They listened. From the drawing-room came the sound of a high-pitched voice. Mr. Brown groaned. "Good Lord!" he moaned. "I'm here for a rest cure, and he comes bleating into every room in the house. Is the smoking room safe? Does he smoke?" Mr. Percival Jones was feeling slightly troubled in his usually peaceful conscience. He could honestly say he had never smoked. He could honestly say that he had never drank. But in his bedroom reposed 2 bottles of brandy, purchased at the advice of an aunt in case of emergencies. In his bedroom also was a box of cigars that he had bought for a cousin's birthday gift, but which his conscience had finally forbidden to present. He decided to consign these 2 emblems of vice to the waves that very evening. Meanwhile, William had returned to the hut and was composing a tale of smugglers by the light of a candle. He was much intrigued by his subject. He wrote fast in an illegible hand, in great sloping lines, his brows frowning, his tongue protruding from his mouth, as it always did in moments of mental strain. His sympathies wavered between the smugglers and the representatives of law and order. His orthography was the despair of his teachers. "Ho," says Dick Savage, he wrote. "Ho, gadzooks! Roll in the bottles of beer up the beach. Fill your pockets with the baccy from the boat. Quick now, gadzooks! Methinks we are observed." He glared round in the darkness. In less time than what it takes to write this, he was surrounded by pleesmen, and stood, proud and defiant, in the light of their electric torches, what they had wiped quick as lightning from their bosoms. "Surrender!" cried one, holding a gun at his brain and a drawn sword at his heart. "Surrender or die!" "Never!" said Dick Savage, throwing back his head, proud and defiant. "Never! Do to me what you will, you dirty dogs. I will never surrender. Sooner I will die." One cruel brute hit him a blow on the lips, and he sprang back, snarling with rage. In less time than what it takes to write this, he had sprung at his torturer's throat, and his teeth met in one mighty bite. His torturer dropped dead and lifeless at his feet. "Ho!" cried Dick Savage, throwing back his head, and proud and defiant again. "So dies any of you what insults my proud manhood. I will meet my teeth in your throats." For a minute they stood trembling. Then one, bolder than the rest, leapt forward and tied Dick Savage's hands with rope behind his back. Another took from his pockets bottles of beer and tobacco in large quantities. "Ho!" they cried, exulting. "Ho, Dick Savage, the smuggler caught at last!" Dick Savage gave one proud and defiant laugh, and, bringing his tied hands over his head, he bit the rope with one mighty bite. "Ho, ho!" he cried, throwing back his proud head. "Ho, ho, you dirty dogs!" Then, draining to the dregs a large bottle of poison he had concealed in his bosom, he fell dead and lifeless at their feet. There was a timid knock at the door, and William, scowling impatiently, rose to open it. "What do you want?" he said curtly. A little voice answered from the dusk.
"It's me, Peggy. I've come to see how you are, William. They don't know I've come. I was awful sick after that seaweed this morning, William."
William looked at her with a superior frown. "Go away," he said. "I'm busy."
"What are you doing?"
she said, poking her little curly head into the doorway. "I'm writing a tale." She clasped her hands.
"Oh, how lovely! Oh, William, do read it to me. I'd love it."
Mollified, he opened the door, and she took her seat on his buckskin on the floor, and William sat by the candle, clearing his throat, for a minute before he began. During the reading she never took her eyes off him. At the end she drew a deep breath.
"Oh, William, it's beautiful. William, are there smugglers now?"
"Oh, yes, millions," he said carelessly.
"Here?"
"Of course there are." She went to the door and looked out at the dusk.
"I'd love to see one. What do they smuggle, William?"
He came and joined her at the door, walking with a slight swagger, as became a man of literary fame. "Oh, beer and cigars and things. Millions of 'em." A furtive figure was passing the door, casting suspicious glances to left and right. He held his coat tightly round him, clasping something inside it. "I expect that's one," said William casually. They watched the figure out of sight. Suddenly William's eyes shone. "Let's stalk him and catch him," he said excitedly. "Come on, let's take some weapons." He seized his pop gun from a corner. "You take." He looked round the room. You take the waste paper basket to put over his head and pin down his arms and something to tie him up. I know. The skin he shot in Africa. You can tie its paws in front of him. Come on, let's catch him smuggling." He stepped out boldly into the dusk with his pop-gun, followed by the blindly obedient Peggy carrying the waste paper basket in one hand and the skin in the other. Mr. Percival Jones was making quite a little ceremony of consigning his brandy and cigars to the waves. He had composed a little effort upon it, which began, "O deeps, receive these objects vile, which nevermore mine eyes shall soil." He went down to the edge of the sea, and, taking a bottle in each hand, held them out at arm's length, while he began in his high-pitched voice, "O deeps, receive these—" He stopped. A small boy stood beside him, holding out at him the point of what in the semi-darkness Mr. Jones took to be a loaded rifle. William mistook his actions in holding out the bottles. "It's no good trying to drink it up," he said severely. "We've caught you smuggling." Mr. Percival Jones laughed nervously. "My little man," he said, "that's a very dangerous thing you have. Suppose you hand it over to me now, like a good little chap." William recognized his voice. "Fancy you being a smuggler all the time," he said, with righteous indignation in his voice. "Take away that nasty gun, little boy," pleaded his captive plaintively. "You don't understand it. It might go off." William was not a boy to indulge in half measures. He meant to carry the matter off with a high hand. "I'll shoot you dead," he said dramatically, "if you don't do just what I tell you." Mr. Percival Jones wiped the perspiration from his brow. "Where did you get that rifle, little boy?" he asked in a voice he strove to make playful. Is it loaded?" "It's unwise, little boy, most unwise. Give it to me to take care of. It might go off, you know." William moved the muzzle of his weapon, and Mr. Percival Jones shuddered from head to foot. William was a brave boy, but he had experienced a moment of cold terror when he had first approached his captive. The first note of the quavering, high-pitched voice had, however, reassured him. He instantly knew himself to be the better man. His captive's obvious terror of his pop-gun almost persuaded him that he held in his hand some formidable death-dealing instrument. As a matter of fact, Mr. Percival Jones was temperamentally an abject coward. "You will walk up to the seats," commanded William. "I've took you prisoner for smuggling, and just walk up to the seats." Mr. Percival Jones obeyed with alacrity. "Don't press anything, little boy," he pleaded as he went. "It might go off by accident. You might do untold damage." Peggy, armed with the waste paper basket and the skin, followed open-mouthed. At the seat, William paused. "Peggy, you put the basket over his head and pin his arms down in case he struggles, and tie the skin what I shot round him, in case he struggles." Peggy stood upon the seat and obeyed. Their victim made no protest. He seemed to himself to be in some horrible dream. The only thing of which he was conscious was the dimly descried weapon that William held out at him in the darkness. He was hardly aware of the waste paper basket thrust over his head. He watched William anxiously through the basket work. "Be careful," he murmured. "Be careful, boy." He hardly felt the skin, which was fastened tightly round his unresisting form by Peggy, the tail tied to one front paw. Unconsciously he still clasped a bottle of brandy in each arm. Then came the irate summons of Peggy's nurse through the dusk. "Oh, William," she said, panting with excitement, "I don't want to leave you. Oh, William, he might kill you." "You go on. I'm all right," he said with conscious valor. "He can't do nothing, 'cause I've got a gun and I can shoot him dead." Mr. Percival Jones shuddered afresh. "And he's all tied up, and I've took him prisoner, and I'm going to take him home." "Oh, William, you are brave," she whispered in the darkness as she flitted away to her nurse. William blushed with pride and embarrassment. Mr. Percival Jones was convinced that he had to deal with a youthful lunatic armed with a dangerous weapon, and was anxious only to humour him till the time of danger was over and he could be placed under proper restraint. Unconscious of his peculiar appearance, he walked before his captor, casting propitiatory glances behind him. "It's all right, little boy," he said soothingly. "Quite all right. I'm your friend. Don't get annoyed, little boy. Don't get annoyed. Won't you put your gun down, little man? Won't you let me carry it for you?" William walked behind, still pointing his pop gun. "I've took you prisoner for smuggling," he repeated doggedly. "I'm taking you home. You're my prisoner. I've took you." They met no one on the road, though Mr. Percival Jones threw longing glances around, ready to appeal to any passer-by for rescue. He was afraid to raise his voice in case it should rouse his youthful captor to murder. He saw with joy the gate of his boarding-house, and hastened up the walk and up the stairs. The drawing-room door was open. There was help and assistance. There was protection against this strange persecution. He entered, followed closely by William. It was about the time he had promised to read his little effort on the coming of spring to his circle of admirers. A group of elderly ladies sat round the fire awaiting him. Ethel was writing. They turned as he entered, and a gasp of horror and incredulous dismay went up. It was that gasp that called him to a realization of the fact that he was wearing a waste-paper basket over his head and shoulders, and that a mangy fur rug was tied round his arms. "Mr. Jones!" they gasped. He gave a wrench to his shoulders, and the rug fell to the floor, revealing a bottle of brandy clasped in either arm. "Mr. Jones!" they repeated. "I caught him smuggling," said William proudly. "I caught him smuggling beer by the sea, and he was drinking those 2 bottles he'd smuggled, and he had thousands and thousands of cigars all over him, and I caught him. And he's a smuggler, and I brought him up here with my gun. He's a smuggler, and I took him prisoner." Mr. Jones, red and angry, his hair awry, glared through the wickerwork of his basket. He moistened his lips. "This is an outrage," he spluttered. Horrified elderly eyes stared at the incriminating bottles. "He was drinking 'em by the sea," said William. "Mr. Jones!" they chorused again. He flung off his waste-paper basket and turned upon the proprietress of the establishment, who stood by the door. I will not brook such treatment," he stammered in fury. "I will leave your roof to-night. I am outraged, humiliated. I disdain to explain. I leave your roof to-night." "Mr. Jones!" they said once more. Mr. Jones, still clasping his bottles, withdrew, pausing to glare at William on his way. "You wicked boy! You wicked little untruthful boy!" he said. William looked after him. "He's my prisoner, and they've let him go," he said aggrievedly. 10 minutes later he wandered into the smoking-room. Mr. Brown sat miserably in a chair by a dying fire beneath a poor light. "Is he still bleating there?" he said. "Is this still the only corner where I can be sure of keeping my sanity? Is he reading his beastly poetry upstairs? Is he—" "He's going," said William moodily. "He's going before dinner. They've sent for his cab. He's mad 'cause I said he was a smuggler. He was a smuggler 'cause I saw him doing it. And I took him prisoner, and he got mad, and he's going. And they're mad at me 'cause I took him prisoner. You'd think they'd be glad at me catching smugglers, but they're not," bitterly. "And mother says she'll tell you, and you'll be mad too, and—" Mr. Brown raised his hand. "1 minute, my son," he said. "Your story is confused. Do I understand that Mr. Jones is going, and that you are the cause of his departure?" "Yes, 'cause he got mad 'cause I said he was a smuggler, and he was a smuggler, and they're mad at me now, and—" Mr. Brown laid a hand on his son's shoulder. "There are moments, William," he said, "when I feel almost affectionate towards you." End of Chapter 11. William and the Smuggler. Read by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Chapter 12 of More William. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barbara Bulkley of BigBible.org. More William by Richmal Crompton. Chapter 12. The Reform of William. To William the idea of reform was new and startling and not wholly unattractive. It originated with the housemaid whose brother was a reformed burglar now employed in a grocer's shop. "'E's got conversion," she said to William. "'E got it quite sudden like, and 'e give up all his bad ways straight off. 'E's been like a heavenly saint ever since." William was deeply interested. The point was all innocently driven in later by the Sunday school mistress. William's family had no real faith in the Sunday school as a corrective to William's inherent wickedness, but they knew that no Sabbath peace or calm was humanly possible while William was in the house, so they brushed and cleaned and tidied him at 2:45 and sent him pained and protesting down the road every Sunday afternoon. Their only regret was that Sunday school did not begin earlier and end later. Fortunately for William, most of his friends' parents were inspired by the same zeal, so that he met his old cronies of the weekdays, Henry, Ginger, Douglas, and all the rest, and together they beguiled the monotony of the Sabbath. But this Sunday the tall, pale lady, who, for her sins, essayed to lead William and his friends along the straight and narrow path of virtue, was almost inspired. She was like some prophetess of old. She was so emphatic that the red cherries that hung coquettishly over the edge of her hat rattled against it as though in applause. "We must all start afresh," she said. "We must all be turned. That's what conversion means." William's fascinated eye wandered from the cherries to the distant view out of the window. He thought suddenly of the noble burglar who had turned his back upon the mysterious, nefarious tools of his trade, and now dispensed margarine to his former victims. Opposite him sat a small girl in a pink and white checked frock. He often whiled away the dullest hours of Sunday school by putting out his tongue at her, or throwing paper pellets at her, manufactured previously for the purpose. But today, meeting her serious eye, he looked away hastily. "And we must all help someone," went on the urgent voice. "If we have turned ourselves, we must help someone else to turn." Determined and eager was the eye that the small girl turned upon William, and William realized that his time had come. He was to be converted. He felt almost thrilled by the prospect. He was so enthralled that he received absent-mindedly and without gratitude the mountainous bull's-eye passed to him from Ginger, and only gave a half-hearted smile when a well-aimed pellet from Henry's hand sent one of the prophetess's cherries swinging high in the air. After the class, the pink-checked girl, whose name most appropriately was Deborah, stalked William for several yards and finally cornered him. "William," she said, "are you going to turn?" "I'm going to think about it," said William guardedly. "William, I think you ought to turn. I'll help you," she added sweetly. William drew a deep breath. "All right, I will," he said. She heaved a sigh of relief. "You'll begin now, won't you?" she said earnestly. William considered. There were several things that he had wanted to do for some time but hadn't managed to do yet. He had not tried turning off the water at the main and hiding the key and seeing what would happen. He hadn't tried shutting up the cat in the hen-house. He hadn't tried painting his long-suffering mongrel Jumble with the pot of green paint that was in the tool-shed. He hadn't tried pouring water into the receiver of the telephone. He hadn't tried locking the cook into the larder. There were, in short, whole fields of crime entirely unexplored. All these things and others must be done before the Reformation. "I can't begin just yet," said William. "Say day after tomorrow." She considered this for a minute. "Very well," she said at last reluctantly. "Day after tomorrow." The next day dawned bright and fair. William arose with a distinct sense that something important had happened. Then he thought of the Reformation. He saw himself leading a quiet and blameless life, walking sedately to school, working at high pressure in school, doing his homework conscientiously in the evening, being exquisitely polite to his family, his instructors, and the various foolish people who visited his home for the sole purpose, apparently, of making inane remarks to him. He saw all this, and the picture was far from unattractive in the distance. In the immediate future, however, there were various quite important things to be done. There was a whole normal lifetime of crime to be crowded into one day. Looking out of his window, he espied the gardener bending over one of the beds. The gardener had a perfectly bald head. William had sometimes idly imagined the impact of a pea sent violently from a pea-shooter with the gardener's bald head. Before, there had been a lifetime of experiment before him, and he had put off this one idly in favour of something more pressing. Now there was only one day. He took up his pea-shooter and aimed carefully. The pea did not embed itself deeply into the gardener's skull as William had sometimes thought it would. It bounced back. It bounced back quite hard. The gardener also bounced back with a yell of anger, shaking his fist at William's window. But William had discreetly retired. He hid the pea-shooter, assumed his famous expression of innocence, and felt distinctly cheered.
The question as to what exactly would happen when the pea met the baldness was now forever solved. The gardener retired grumbling to the potting shed, so, for the present, all was well. Later in the day the gardener might lay his formal complaint before authority, but later in the day was later in the day. It did not trouble William. He dressed briskly and went down to breakfast with a frown of concentration upon his face. It was the last day of his old life. No one else was in the dining room. It was the work of a few minutes to remove the bacon from beneath the big pewter cover and substitute the kitten, to put a tablespoon of salt into the coffee, and to put a 2-days-old paper in place of that morning's. They were all things that he had at one time or another vaguely thought of doing, but for which he had never yet seemed to have time or opportunity. Warming to his subject, he removed the egg from under the egg cosy on his sister's plate, and placed in its stead a worm which had just appeared in the window box, in readiness for the early bird. He surveyed the scene with a deep sigh of satisfaction. The only drawback was that he felt he could not safely stay to watch results. William possessed a true strategic instinct for the right moment for a retreat. Hearing, therefore, a heavy step on the stairs, he seized several pieces of toast and fled. As he fled he heard through the open window violent sounds proceeding from the enraged kitten beneath the cover, and then the still more violent sounds proceeding from the unknown person who had removed the cover. The kitten, a mass of fury and lust for revenge, came flying through the window. William hid behind a laurel bush till it had passed, then set off down the road. School, of course, was impossible. The precious hours of such a day as this could not be wasted in school. He went down the road full of his noble purpose. The wickedness of a lifetime was somehow or other to be crowded into this day. Tomorrow it would all be impossible. Tomorrow began the blameless life. It must all be worked off today. He skirted the school by a field path, in case any of those narrow souls paid to employ so aimlessly the precious hours of his youth might be there. They would certainly be tactless enough to question him as he passed the door. Then he joined the main road. The main road was empty except for a caravan gaily painted in red and yellow. It had little lace curtains at the window. It was altogether a most fascinating caravan. No one seemed to be near it. William looked through the windows. There was a kind of dresser with crockery hanging from it, a small table and a little oil stove. The further part was curtained off, but no sound came from it, so that it was presumably empty too. William wandered round to inspect the quadruped in front. It appeared to be a mule with a jaundiced view of life. It rolled a sad eye towards William, then with a deep sigh returned to its contemplation of the landscape. William gazed upon caravan and steed fascinated. Never in his future life of noble merit would he be able to annex a caravan. It was his last chance. No one was about. He could pretend that he'd mistaken it for his own caravan, or had got onto it by mistake, or anything. Conscience stirred faintly in his breast, but he silenced it sternly. Conscience was to rule him for the rest of his life, and it could jolly well let him alone this day. With some difficulty he climbed onto the driver's seat, took the reins, said "Gee up" to the melancholy mule, and the whole equipage, with a jolt and a faint rattle, set out along the road. William did not know how to drive, but it did not seem to matter. The mule ambled along, and William, high up on the driver's seat, the reins held with ostentatious carelessness in one hand, the whip poised lightly in the other, was in the seventh heaven of bliss. He was driving a caravan. He was driving a caravan. He was driving a caravan. The very telegraph posts seemed to gape with envy and admiration as he passed. What ultimately he was going to do with his caravan he neither knew nor cared. All that mattered was, it was a bright sunny morning, and all the others were in school, and he was driving a red and yellow caravan along the high road. The birds seemed to be singing a paean of praise to him. He was intoxicated with pride. It was his caravan, his road, his world. Carelessly he flicked the mule with the whip. There are several explanations of what happened then. The mule may not have been used to the whip. A wasp may have just stung him at that particular minute. A wandering demon may have entered into him. Mules are notoriously accessible to wandering demons. Whatever the explanation, the mule suddenly started forward and galloped at full speed down the hill. The reins dropped from William's hands. He clung for dear life onto his seat, as the caravan, swaying and jolting along the uneven road, seemed to be doing its utmost to fling him off. There came a rattle of crockery from within. Then suddenly there came another sound from within, a loud, agonized scream. It was a female scream. Someone who'd been asleep behind the curtain had just awakened. William's hair stood on end. He almost forgot to cling to the seat, for not one scream came, but many. They rent the still summer air, mingled with the sound of breaking glass and crockery. The mule continued his mad career down the hill, his reins trailing in the dust. In the distance was a little gypsy's donkey cart full of pots and pans. William found his voice suddenly and began to warn the mule. "Look out, you old softy," he yelled. "Look out for the donk, you old ass." But the mule refused to be warned. He neatly escaped the donkey cart himself, but he crashed the caravan into it with such force that the caravan broke a shaft and overturned completely onto the donkey cart, scattering pots and pans far and wide. From within the caravan came inhuman female yells of fear and anger. William had fallen onto a soft bank of grass. He was discovering to his amazement that he was still alive and practically unhurt. The mule was standing meekly by and smiling to himself. Then out of the window of the caravan climbed a woman, a fat, angry woman, shaking her fist at the world in general. Her hair and face were covered with sugar, and a fork was embedded in the front of her dress. Otherwise she too had escaped undamaged. The owner of the donkey cart arose from the melee of pots and pans and turned upon her fiercely. She screamed at him furiously in reply. Then along the road could be seen the figure of a fat man carrying a fishing rod. He began to run wildly towards the caravan. "Ach, Gott in Himmel!" he cried as he ran. "My beautiful caravan! Who has this to it done?" He joined the frenzied altercation that was going on between the donkey man and the fat woman. The air was rent by their angry shouts. A group of highly appreciative villagers collected round them. Then one of them pointed to William, who sat, feeling still slightly shaken, upon the bank. "It was 'im what done it," he said. "It was 'im that was a-drivin' of it down the hill." With one wild glance at the scene of devastation and anger, William turned and fled through the wood. "Ach, Gott in Himmel!" screamed the fat man, beginning to pursue him. The fat woman and the donkey man joined the pursuit. To William it was like some ghastly nightmare after an evening's entertainment at the cinematograph. Meanwhile the donkey and the mule fraternized over the debris, and the villagers helped themselves to all they could find. But the fat man was very fat, and the fat woman was very fat, and the donkey man was very old, and William was young and very fleet, so in less than 10 minutes they gave up the pursuit and returned panting and quarrelling to the road. William sat on the further outskirts of the wood and panted. He felt, on the whole, exhilarated by the adventure. It was quite a suitable adventure for his last day of unregeneration. But he felt also in need of bodily sustenance, so he purchased a bun and a bottle of lemonade at a neighbouring shop, and sat by the roadside to recover. There were no signs of his pursuers. He felt reluctant to return home. It is always well to follow a morning's absence from school by an afternoon's absence from school. A return in the afternoon is ignominious and humiliating. William wandered round the neighbourhood, experiencing all the thrill of the outlaw. Certainly by this time the gardener would have complained to his father. Probably the schoolmistress would have sent a note. Also, someone had been scratched by the cat. William decided that, all things considered, it was best to make a day of it. He spent part of the afternoon in throwing stones at a scarecrow. His aim was fairly good, and he succeeded in knocking off the hat and finally prostrating the wooden framework. Followed an exciting chase by an angry farmer. It was after tea time when he returned home, walking with careless bravado, as of a criminal who has drunk of crime to its very depth and flaunts it before the world. His spirits sank a little as he approached the gate. He could see through the trees the fat caravan owner gesticulating at the door. Helped by the villagers, he had tracked William. Phrases floated to him through the summer air. "Mein beautiful caravan! Ach, Gott in Himmel!" He could see the gardener smiling in the distance. There was a small blue bruise on his shining head. William judged from the smile that he had laid his formal complaint before authority. William noticed that his father looked pale and harassed. He noticed also with a thrill of horror that his hand was bound up and that there was a long scratch down his cheek. He knew the cat had scratched somebody, but crumbs! A small boy came down the road and saw William hesitating at the open gateway. "You'll catch it," he said cheerfully. "They've wrote to say you wasn't in school." William crept round to the back of the house beneath the bushes. He felt that the time had come to give himself up to justice, but he wanted, as the popular saying is, to be sure of getting his money's worth. There was the tin half full of green paint in the tool shed. He'd had his eye on it for some time. He went quietly round to the tool shed. Soon he was contemplating with a satisfied smile a green and enraged cat and a green and enraged hen. Then, bracing himself for the effort, he delivered himself up to justice. When all was said and done, no punishment could be really adequate to a day like that. Dusk was falling. William gazed pensively from his bedroom window. He was reviewing his day. He had almost forgotten the stormy and decidedly unpleasant scene with his father. Mr. Brown's rhetoric had been rather lost on William because its pearls of sarcasm had been so far above his head. And William had not been really loath to retire at once to bed. After all, it had been a very tiring day. Now his thoughts were going over some of its most exquisite moments, the moments when the pea and the gardener's head met and rebounded with such satisfactory force, the moment when he swung along the high road, monarch of a caravan and a mule and the whole wide world, the moment when the scarecrow hunched up and collapsed so realistically, the cat covered with green paint. After all, it was his last day. He saw himself from tomorrow onward leading a quiet and blameless life, walking sedately to school, working at high pressure in school, doing his homework conscientiously in the evening, being exquisitely polite to his family and instructors. And the vision failed utterly to attract. Moreover, he hadn't yet tried turning off the water at the main, or locking the cook into the larder, or hundreds of things. There came a gentle voice from the garden. "William, where are you?" William looked down and met the earnest gaze of Deborah. "Hello," he said. "William," she said, "you won't forget that you're going to start tomorrow, will you?" William looked at her firmly. "I can't just tomorrow," he said. "I'm putting it off. I'm putting it off for a year or two." End of chapter 12. The Reform of William. Read by Barbara Bulkley of BigBible.org.
More William by Richmal Crompton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org. Chapter 13. William and the Ancient Souls. The house next to William's had been unoccupied for several months, and William had made full use of its garden. Its garden was in turns a jungle, a desert, an ocean, and an enchanted island. William invited select parties of his friends to it. He had come to look upon it as his own property. He hunted wild animals in it with Jumble, his trusty hound. He tracked Red Indians in it, again with Jumble, his trusty hound. And he attacked and sank ships in it, making his victims walk the plank, again with the help and assistance of Jumble, his trusty hound. Sometimes, to vary the monotony, he made Jumble, his trusty hound, walk the plank into the rain tub. This was one of the many unpleasant things that William brought into Jumble's life. It was only his intense love for William that reconciled him to his existence. Jumble was one of the very few beings who appreciated William. The house on the other side was a much smaller one, and was occupied by Mr. Gregorius Lambkin. Mr. Gregorius Lambkin was a very shy and rather elderly bachelor. He issued from his front door every morning at 8:30, holding a neat little attaché case in a neatly gloved hand. He spent the day in an insurance office, and returned, still unruffled and immaculate, at about 6:30. Most people considered him quite dull and negligible, but he possessed the supreme virtue in William's eyes of not objecting to William. William had suffered much from unsympathetic neighbours who had taken upon themselves to object to such innocent and artistic objects as catapults and pea shooters and cricket balls. William had a very soft spot in his heart for Mr. Gregorius Lambkin. William spent a good deal of his time in Mr. Lambkin's garden during his absence, and Mr. Lambkin seemed to have no objection. Other people's gardens always seemed to William to be more attractive than his own, especially when he had no right of entry into them. There was quite an excitement in the neighbourhood when the empty house was let. It was rumoured that the newcomer was a personage. She was the president of the Society of Ancient Souls. The Society of Ancient Souls was a society of people who remembered their previous existence. The memory usually came in a flash. For instance, you might remember in a flash, when you were looking at a box of matches, that you had been Guy Fawkes. Or you might look at a cow and remember in a flash that you had been Nebuchadnezzar. Then you joined the Society of Ancient Souls and paid a large subscription and attended meetings at the house of its president, in costume. And the president was coming to live next door to William. By a curious coincidence, her name was Gregoria, Miss Gregoria Marsh. William awaited her coming with anxiety. He had discovered that one's next door neighbours make a great difference to one's life. They may be agreeable and not object to mouth organs and whistling and occasional stone throwing, or they may not. They sometimes, the worst kind, go to the length of writing notes to one's father about one, and then, of course, the only course left to one is one of revenge. But William hoped great things from Miss Gregoria Marsh. There was a friendly sound about the name. On the evening of her arrival he climbed up on the roller and gazed wistfully over the fence at the territory that had once been his, but from which he was now debarred. He felt like Moses surveying the promised land. Miss Gregoria Marsh was walking in the garden. William watched her with bated breath. She was very long and very thin and very angular, and she was reading poetry out loud to herself as she trailed about in her long draperies. "Oh, moon of my delight!" she exclaimed. Then her eye met William's. The eyes beneath her pince nez were like little gimlets. "How dare you stare at me, you rude boy?" she said. William gasped. "I shall write to your father," she said fiercely, and then proceeded still ferociously. "That knows no wane." "Crumbs," murmured William, descending slowly from his perch. She did write to his father, and that note was the first of many. She objected to his singing. She objected to his shouting. She objected to his watching her over the wall, and she objected to his throwing sticks at her cat. She objected both verbally and in writing. This persecution was only partially compensated for by occasional glimpses of meetings of the Ancient Souls. For the Ancient Souls met in costume, and sometimes William could squeeze through the hole in the fence and watch the Ancient Souls meeting in the dining room. Miss Gregoria Marsh, arrayed as Mary Queen of Scots, one of her many previous existences, was worth watching. And always there was the garden on the other side. Mr. Gregorius Lambkin made no objections and wrote no notes. But clouds of fate were gathering round Mr. Gregorius Lambkin. William first heard of it one day at lunch. "I saw the old loony talking to poor little Lambkin to-day," said Robert, William's elder brother. In these terms did Robert refer to the august president of the Society of Ancient Souls. And the next news Robert brought home was that poor little Lambkin had joined the Society of Ancient Souls, but didn't seem to want to talk about it. He seemed very vague as to his previous existence, but he said that Miss Gregoria Marsh was sure that he had been Julius Caesar. The knowledge had come to her in a flash, when he raised his hat and she saw his bald head. There was a meeting of the Ancient Souls that evening, and William crept through the hole and up to the dining-room window to watch. A gorgeous scene met his eye. Noah conversed agreeably with Cleopatra in the window-seat, and by the piano Napoleon discussed the Irish question with Lobengula. As William watched, his small nose flattened against a corner of the window. Nero and Dante arrived, having shared a taxi from the station. Miss Gregoria Marsh, tall and gaunt and angular, presided in the robes of Mary Queen of Scots, which was her favourite previous existence. Then Mr. Gregorius Lambkin arrived. He looked as unhappy as it is possible for man to look. He was dressed in a toga and a laurel wreath. Heat and nervousness had caused his small waxed moustache to droop. His toga was too long, and his laurel wreath was crooked. Miss Gregoria Marsh received him effusively. She carried him off to a corner seat near the window, and there they conversed. Or, to be more accurate, she talked and he listened. The window was open, and William could hear some of the things she said. "Now you are a member, you must come here often. You and I, the only ancient souls in this vicinity. We will work together and live only in the past. Have you remembered any other previous existence? No? Ah, try. It will come to you in a flash at any time. I must come and see your garden. I feel we have much in common, you and I. We have much to talk about. I have all my past life to tell you of. What train do you come home by? We must be friends, real friends. I'm sure I can help you much in your life as an ancient soul. Our names are almost the same. Fate in some way unites us." And Mr. Lambkin sat, miserable and dejected, and yet with a certain pathetic resignation. For what can one do against fate? Then the President caught sight of William and approached the window. "Go away, boy!" she called. "You wicked, rude, prying boy, go away!" Mr. Lambkin shot a wretched and apologetic glance at William, but William pressed his mouth to the open slit of the window. "All right, Mrs. Jarley's," he called, then turned and fled. William met Mr. Lambkin on his way to the station the next morning. Mr. Lambkin looked thinner, and there were lines of worry on his face. "I'm sorry she sent you away, William," he said.
It must have been interesting to watch. Most interesting to watch.
"I'd much rather have watched than but there, it's very kind of her to take such an interest in me. Most kind. But however, she's very kind. Very kind. She very kindly presented me with the costume. Hardly suitable, perhaps, but very kind of her. And of course there may be something in it. One never knows. I may have been Julius Caesar, but I hardly think. However, one must keep an open mind. Do you know any Latin, William?" "Just a bit," said William guardedly. "I've learnt a lot, but I don't know much."
"Say some to me. It might convey something to me. One never knows. She seems so sure. Talk Latin to me, William."
"Hic, haec, hoc," said William obligingly. Julius Caesar's reincarnation shook his head.
"No," he said. "I'm afraid it doesn't seem to mean anything to me."
"Hunc, hanc, hoc," went on William monotonously.
"I'm afraid it's no good," said Mr. Lambkin. "I'm afraid it just proves that I'm not. Still, one may not retain a knowledge of one's former tongue. One must keep an open mind. Of course, I prefer not to, but one must be fair. She's very kind, very kind." Shaking his head sadly, the little man entered the station. That evening William heard his father say to his mother: "She came down to meet him at the station to-night. I'm afraid his doom is sealed. He's no power of resistance, and she's got her eye on him."
"Who's got her eye on him?"
said William with interest.
"Be quiet," said
his father, with the brusqueness of the male parent. But William began to see how things stood, and William liked Mr. Lambkin. One evening he saw from his window Mr. Gregorius Lambkin walking with Miss Gregoria Marsh in Miss Gregoria Marsh's garden. Mr. Gregorius Lambkin did not look happy. William crept down to the hole in the fence and applied his ear to it. They were sitting on a seat quite close to his hole.
"Gregorius,"
the president of the Society of Ancient Souls was saying, "when I found out that our names were the same, I knew that our destinies were interwoven."
"Yes,"
murmured Mr. Lambkin. "It's so kind of you, so kind. I'm afraid I'm overstaying my welcome. I must
"No."
I must say what is in my heart, Gregorius. You live on the past, I live in the past. We have a common mission, the mission of bringing to the thoughtless and uninitiated the memory of their former lives. Gregorius, our work would be much more valuable if we could do it together, if the common destiny that has united our nomenclatures could unite also our lives."
"It's so kind of you,"
murmured the writhing victim. "So kind. I am so unfit. No, friend," she said kindly. "I have power enough for both. Human speech is so poor an agent, is it not?" The door bell clanged in the house.
Ah, the Committee of the Ancient Souls. They were coming from town tonight. Come here tomorrow night at the same time, Gregorius, and I will tell you what is in my heart. Meet me here at this time tomorrow evening." William here caught sight of a stray cat at the other end of the garden. In the character of a cannibal chief, he hunted the white man, otherwise the cat, with blood-curdling war-whoops, but felt no real interest in the chase. He bound up his scratches mechanically with an ink-stained handkerchief. Then he went indoors. Robert was conversing with his friend in the library. "Well," said the friend, "it's nearly a month. Has she landed him yet?" "By Jove," said Robert. "1st of April tomorrow." He looked at William suspiciously. "And if you try any fool's tricks on me, you'll jolly well hear about it." "I'm not thinking of you," said William crushingly. "I'm not going to trouble with you." "Has she landed him?" said the friend. "Not yet. And I heard him saying in the train that he was leaving town on the 2nd and going abroad for a holiday." "Well, she'll probably do it yet. She's got all the 1st." "It's bedtime, William," called his mother. "Thank heaven," said Robert. William sat gazing into the distance, not seeing or hearing. "William!" called his mother. "All right," said William irritably. "I was just thinking something out." William's family went about their ways cautiously the next morning. They watched William carefully. Robert even refused an egg at breakfast, because you never knew with that little wretch. But nothing happened. "Fancy your going on April Fool's Day without making a fool of anyone," said Robert at lunch. "It's not over, is it? Not yet," said William with the air of a sphinx. "But it doesn't count after 12," said Robert. William considered deeply before he spoke. Then he said slowly, "The thing what I'm going to do counts whatever time it is." Reluctantly, but as if drawn by a magnet, Mr. Lambkin set off to the President's house. William was in the road. "She told me to tell you," said William unblushingly, "that she was busy to-night, and would you mind not coming?" The tense lines on Mr. Lambkin's face relaxed. "Oh, William," he said, "it's such a great relief. I'm going away early to-morrow, but I was afraid that to-night—" He was almost hysterical with relief. "She's so kind, but I was afraid that—well, I can't say I'm sorry. I'd promised to come, and I couldn't break it. But I was afraid. I hear she's sold her house and is leaving in a month. But she's kind, very kind." He turned back with alacrity. "Thanks for letting me have the clothes," said William. "Oh, quite welcome, William. They're nice things for a boy to dress up in, no doubt. I can't say but she's very kind. Don't let her see you playing with them, William." William grunted and returned to his back garden. For some time silence reigned over the 3 back gardens. Then Miss Gregoria Marsh emerged and came towards the seat by the fence. A figure was already seated there in the half dark, a figure swathed in a toga, with the toga drawn also over its drooping head. "Gregorius," said the President, "how dear of you to come in costume." The figure made no movement. "You know what I have in my heart, Gregorius?" Still no answer. "Your heart is too full for words," she said kindly. "The thought of having your destiny linked with mine takes speech from you. But have courage, dear Gregorius. You shall work for me. We will do great things together. We will be married at the little church." Still no answer. "Gregorius," she murmured tenderly. She leant against him suddenly, and he yielded beneath the pressure with a sudden sound of dissolution. 2 cushions slid to the ground. The toga fell back, revealing a broomstick with a turnip fixed firmly to the top. It bore the legend, "April Fool." From the other side of the fence came a deep sigh of satisfaction from the artist behind the scenes. End of Chapter 13. William and the Ancient Souls. Read by Tim Bulkley of BigBible.org.
Chapter 14 of More William. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Barbara Bulkley of BigBible.org.
More William by Richmal Crompton. Chapter 14. William's Christmas Eve. It was Christmas. The air was full of excitement and secrecy. William, whose old-time faith in notes to Father Christmas sent up the chimney had died a natural death as a result of bitter experience, had thoughtfully presented each of his friends and relations with a list of his immediate requirements. He had a vague and not unfounded misgiving that his family would begin at the bottom of the list instead of the top. He was not surprised, therefore, when he saw his father come home rather later than usual, carrying a parcel of books under his arm. A few days afterwards he announced casually at breakfast, "Well, I only hope no one gives me The Great Chief, or The Pirate Ship, or The Land of Danger for Christmas." His father started. "Why?" he said sharply. "Just 'cause I've read them, that's all," explained William with a bland look of innocence. The glance that Mr. Brown threw at his offspring was not altogether devoid of suspicion, but he said nothing. He set off after breakfast with the same parcel of books under his arm, and returned with another. This time, however, he did not put them in the library cupboard, and William searched in vain. The question of Christmas festivities loomed large upon the social horizon. "Robert and Ethel can have their party on the day before Christmas Eve," decided Mrs. Brown, "and then William can have his on Christmas Eve." William surveyed his elder brother and sister gloomily. "Yes, and us eat up just what they've left," he said with bitterness. "I know." Mrs. Brown changed the subject hastily. "Now let's see whom we'll have for your party, William," she said, taking out pencil and paper. "You say whom you'd like, and I'll make a list." "Ginger and Douglas and Henry and Joan," said William promptly. "Yes, who else?" "I'd like the milkman." "You can't have the milkman, William. Don't be so foolish." "Well, I'd like to have Fisty Green. He can whistle with his fingers in his mouth." "He's a butcher's boy, William. You can't have him." "Well, who can I have?" "Johnny Brent?" "I don't like him." "But you must invite him. He asked you to his." "Well, I didn't want to go." Irritably. "You made me." "But if he asks you to his, you must ask him back." "You don't want me to invite folks I don't want," William said in the voice of one goaded against his will into exasperation. "You must invite people who invite you," said Mrs. Brown firmly. "That's what we always do in parties." "Then they've got to invite you again, and it goes on and on and on," argued William. "Where's the sense of it? I don't like Johnny Brett, and he don't like me, and if we go on inviting each other, and our mothers go on making us go, it'll go on and on and on. Where's the sense of it? I only just want to know where's the sense of it." His logic was unanswerable. "Well, anyway, William, I'll draw up the list. You can go and play." William walked away, frowning, with his hands in his pockets. "Where's the sense of it?" he muttered as he went. He began to wend his way towards the spot where he and Douglas and Ginger and Henry met daily in order to while away the hours of the Christmas holidays. At present they lived and moved and had their being in the characters of Indian chiefs. As William walked down the back street, which led by a short cut to their meeting place, he unconsciously assumed an arrogant strut, suggestive of some warrior prince surrounded by his gallant braves. "Garn, swank!" He turned with a dark scowl. On a doorstep sat a little girl gazing up at him with blue eyes beneath a tousled mop of auburn hair. William's eye travelled sternly from her Titian curls to her bare feet. He assumed a threatening attitude and scowled fiercely. "You'd better not say that again," he said darkly. "Why not?" she said with a jeering laugh. "Well, you'd just better not," he said with a still more ferocious scowl. "What did you do?" she persisted. He considered for a moment in silence. Then, "You'd see what I'd do," he said ominously. "Garn, swank," she repeated. "Now do it. Go on, do it." I'll let you off this time," he said judicially. "Garn." "Softy. You can't do anything, you can't. You're a softy." "I could cut your head off and scalp you and leave you hanging on a tree, I could," he said fiercely. "And I will too if you go on calling me names. Softy, swank. Now cut it off. Go on." He looked down at her mocking blue eyes. "You're jolly lucky I don't start on you," he said threateningly. "Folks I do start on soon get sorry, I can tell you." "What do you do to them?" He changed the subject abruptly. "What's your name?" he said. "Sheila." "What's yours?" "Red Hand." William. I'll tell you something if you come and sit down by me. What'll you tell me? Something I bet you don't know. I bet I do. Well, come here and I'll tell you. He advanced towards her suspiciously. Through the open door he could see a bed in a corner of the dark, dirty room and a woman's white face upon the pillow. Oh, come on, said the little girl impatiently. He came on and sat down beside her. Well, he said condescendingly, I bet I knew all the time. No, you didn't. Do you know, she sank her voice to a confidential whisper, there's a chap called Father Christmas what comes down chimneys Christmas Eve and leaves presents in people's houses. He gave a scornful laugh. Oh, that rot. You don't believe that rot, do you? Rot, she repeated indignantly. Why, it's true. True as true. A boy told me what had hanged his stocking up by the chimney, and in the morning it was full of things, and they was just the things what he'd wrote in a bit of paper and thrown up the chimney to this here Christmas chap. Only kids believe that rot, persisted William. I left off believing it years and years ago. Her face grew pink with the effort of convincing him. But the boy told me. The boy what got things from this here chap what comes down chimneys. And I've wrote what I want and sent it up the chimney. Don't you think I'll get it? William looked down at her. Her blue eyes, big with apprehension, were fixed on him. Her little rosy lips were parted. William's heart softened. I dunno, he said doubtfully. You might, I suppose. What do you want for Christmas? You won't tell if I tell you? No. Not to no one? No. Say, cross me throat. William complied with much interest and stored up the phrase for future use. Well, she sank her voice very low and spoke into his ear. Dad's coming out Christmas Eve. She leant back and watched him, anxious to see the effect of this stupendous piece of news. Her face expressed pride and delight. William's merely bewilderment. Coming out, he repeated. Coming out of where? Her expression changed to one of scorn. Prison, of course. Silly. William was half offended, half thrilled. Well, I couldn't know it was prison, could I? How could I know it was prison without being told? It might have been out of anything. What? In hushed curiosity and awe. What was he in prison for? Stealing. Her pride was unmistakable. William looked at her in disapproval. Stealing's wicked, he said virtuously. Huh, she jeered. You can't steal. You're too soft. Softy, you can't steal without being copped first go. You can't. I could, he said indignantly. And anyway, he got copped, didn't he? Or he'd not have been in prison, so there. He didn't get copped first go. It was just a sort of mistake, he said. He said it won't happen again. He's a jolly good stealer. The cops said he was, and they ought to know. Well, said William, changing the conversation, what do you want for Christmas? I wrote it on a bit of paper and sent it up the chimney, she said confidingly. I said I didn't want no toys, nor sweeties, nor nothing. I said I only wanted a nice supper for Dad when he comes out Christmas Eve. We ain't got much money, me and Mother, and we can't get him much of a spread, but if this here Christmas chap sends one for him, it'll be fine. Her eyes were dreamy with ecstasy. William stirred uneasily on his seat. I told you it was rot, he said. There isn't any Father Christmas. It's just an old tale folks tell you when you're a kid, and you find out it's not true. He won't send no supper just 'cause he isn't anything. He's just nothing. It's just an old tale. Oh, shut up! William turned sharply at the sound of the shrill voice from the bed within the room. Let the kid have a bit of pleasure looking forward to it, can't yer? It's little enough she has, anyway. William arose with dignity. All right, he said. Goodbye. He strolled away down the street. Softy! It was a malicious, sweet little voice. Swank! William flushed but forbore to turn round. That evening he met the little girl from next door in the road outside her house. Hello, Joan. Hello, William. In these blue eyes there was no malice or mockery. To Joan, William was a godlike hero. His very wickedness partook of the divine. Would you like to come and make a snowman in our garden, William? She said tentatively. William knit his brows. I dunno, he said ungraciously. I was just kinder thinking. She looked at him silently, hoping he would deign to tell her his thoughts, but not daring to ask. Joan held no modern views on the subject of the equality of the sexes. Do you remember that old tale about Father Christmas, Joan? He said at last. She nodded. Well, suppose you wanted something very bad, and you believed that old tale, and sent a bit of paper up the chimney about what you wanted very bad, and then you never got it. You'd feel kind of rotten, wouldn't you? She nodded again. "I did one time," she said. "I sent a lovely list up the chimney and I never told anyone about it, and I got lots of things for Christmas and not one of the things I'd written for. Did you feel awful rotten?" "Yes, I did. Awful." "I say, Joan," importantly, "I've got her secret." "Do tell me, William," she pleaded. "Can't. It's a crorse me throat secret." She was mystified and impressed. "How lovely, William. Is it something you're going to do?" He considered. "It might be," he said. "I'd love to help." She fixed adoring blue eyes on him. "Well, I'll see," said the Lord of Creation. "I say, Joan, you coming to my party?" "Oh, yes." "Well, there's an awful lot coming. Johnny Brent and all that lot. I'm jolly well not looking forward to it, I can tell you." "Oh, I'm so sorry. Why did you ask them, William?" William laughed bitterly. "Why did I invite them?" he said. "I don't invite people to my parties. They do that." In William's vocabulary, they always signified his immediate family circle. William had a strong imagination. When an idea took hold upon his mind, it was almost impossible for him to let it go. He was quite accustomed to Joan's adoring homage. The scornful mockery of his auburn-haired friend was something quite new, and in some strange fashion it intrigued and fascinated him. Mentally he recalled her excited little face, flushed with eagerness as she described the expected spread. Mentally also he conceived a vivid picture of the long waiting on Christmas Eve, the slowly fading hope, the final bitter disappointment. While engaging in furious snowball fights with Ginger, Douglas and Henry, while annoying peaceful passers-by with well-aimed snow missiles, while bruising himself and most of his family black and blue on long and glassy slides along the garden paths, while prolonging his family's clothes to adorn various unshapely snowmen, while walking across all the ice, preferably cracked, in the neighbourhood, and being several times narrowly rescued from a watery grave, while following all these light holiday pursuits, the picture of the little auburn-haired girl's disappointment was ever vividly present in his mind. The day of his party drew near. "My party," he would echo bitterly when any one of his family mentioned it. "I don't want it. I don't want old Johnny Brent and all that lot. I'd just like to uninvite 'em all." "But you want Ginger and Douglas and Henry," coaxed his mother. "I can have them any time, and I don't like 'em at parties." "They're not the same. I don't like anyone at parties. I don't want a party." "But you must have a party, William, to ask back people who ask you." William took up his previous attitude. "Well, where's the sense of it?" he groaned. As usual, he had the last word, but left his audience unconvinced. They began on him a full hour before his guests were due. He was brushed and scrubbed and scoured and cleaned. He was compressed into an Eton suit and patent leather pumps and finally deposited in the drawing-room, cowed and despondent, his noble spirit all but broken. The guests began to arrive. William shook hands politely with three strangers shining with soap, brushed to excess and clothed in ceremonial Eton suits, who in ordinary life were Ginger, Douglas and Henry. They then sat down and gazed at each other in strained and unnatural silence. They could find nothing to say to each other. Ordinary topics seemed to be precluded by their festive appearance and the formal nature of the occasion. Their informal meetings were usually celebrated by impromptu wrestling matches. This being debarred, a stiff, unnatural atmosphere descended upon them. William was a host. They were guests. They had all listened to final maternal admonitions in which the word manners and politeness recurred at frequent intervals. They were, in fact, for the time being, complete strangers. Then Joan arrived and broke the constrained silence. "Hello, William. Oh, William, you do look nice." William smiled with distant politeness, but his heart warmed to her. It is always some comfort to learn that one has not suffered in vain. "How do you do?" he said with a stiff bow. Then Johnny Brent came, and after him a host of small boys and girls. William greeted friends and foes alike with the same icy courtesy. Then the conjurer arrived. Mrs. Brown had planned the arrangement most carefully. The supper was laid on the big dining-room table. There was to be conjuring for an hour before supper to break the ice. In the meantime, while the conjuring was going on, the grown-ups who were officiating at the party were to have their meal in peace in the library. William had met the conjurer at various parties and despised him utterly. He despised his futile jokes and high-pitched laugh, and he knew his tricks by heart. They sat in rows in front of him, shining-faced, well-brushed little boys in dark Eton suits and gleaming collars, and dainty, white-dressed little girls with gay hair ribbons.
William sat in the back row near the window, and next him sat Joan. She gazed at his set, expressionless face in mute sympathy. He listened to the monotonous voice of the conjurer. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, I will proceed to swallow these 3 needles and these 3 strands of cotton, and shortly to bring out each needle threaded with a strand of cotton. Will any lady step forward and examine the needles? Ladies ought to know all about needles, oughtn't they? You young gentlemen don't learn to sew at school, do you? Ha ha! Perhaps some of you young gentlemen don't know what a needle is. Ha ha!" William scowled, and his thoughts flew off to the little house in the dirty back street. It was Christmas Eve. Her father was coming out. She would be waiting, watching with bright expectant eyes for the spread she had demanded from Father Christmas to welcome her returning parent. It was a beastly shame. She was a silly little lass anyway not to believe him. He'd told her there wasn't any Father Christmas. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, I will bring out the 3 needles threaded with the 3 strands of cotton. Watch carefully, ladies and gentlemen. There, 1, 2, 3. Now, I don't advise you young ladies and gentlemen to try this trick. Needles are very indigestible to some people. Ha ha! Not to me, of course. I can digest anything, needles or marbles or matches or glass bowls, as you will soon see. Ha ha! Now to proceed, ladies and gentlemen." William looked at the clock and sighed. Anyway, there'd be supper soon, and that was a jolly good one, 'cause he'd had a look at it. Suddenly the inscrutable look left his countenance. He gave a sudden gasp, and his whole face lit up. Joan turned to him. "Come on," he whispered, rising stealthily from his seat. The room was in half darkness, and the conjurer was just producing a white rabbit from his left toe, so that few noticed William's quiet exit by the window, followed by that of the blindly obedient Joan. "You wait," he whispered in the darkness of the garden. She waited, shivering in her little white muslin dress, till he returned from the stable, wheeling a hand-cart, consisting of a large packing case on wheels, and finished with a handle. He wheeled it round to the open French window that led into the dining-room. "Come on," he whispered again. Following his example, she began to carry the plates of sandwiches, sausage rolls, meat pies, bread and butter, cakes and biscuits of every variety from the table to the hand-cart. On the top they balanced carefully the plates of jelly and blancmange and dishes of trifle, and round the sides they packed armfuls of crackers. At the end she whispered, "What's it for, William?" "It's the secret," he said, "the cross-me-throat secret I told you." "Am I going to help?" she said in delight. He nodded. "Just wait a minute," he added, and crept from the dining-room to the hall and upstairs. He returned with a bundle of clothing, which he proceeded to arrange in the garden. He first donned his own red dressing-gown, then wound a white scarf round his head, tying it under his chin so that the ends hung down. "I'm making believe I'm Father Christmas," he deigned to explain, "and I'm making believe this white stuff is hair and beard, and this is for you to wear so's you won't get cold." He held out a little white satin cloak, edged with swan's down. "Oh, how lovely, William! But it's not my cloak, it's Sadie Murford's." "Never mind, you can wear it," said William generously. Then, taking the handles of the cart, he set off down the drive. From the drawing-room came the sound of a chorus of delight as the conjurer produced a goldfish in a glass bowl from his head. From the kitchen came the sound of the hilarious laughter of the maids. Only in the dining-room, with its horrible expanse of empty table, was silence. They walked down the road without speaking, till Joan gave a little excited laugh. "This is fun, William. I do wonder what we're going to do." "You'll see," said William. "I'd better not tell you yet. I promised a cross-me-throat promise I wouldn't tell anyone." "All right, William," she said sweetly. "I don't mind a bit." The evening was dark and rather foggy, so that the strange couple attracted little attention except when passing beneath the street lamps. Then certainly people stood still and looked at William and his cart in open-mouthed amazement. At last they turned down a back street towards a door that stood open to the dark, foggy night. Inside the room was a bare table at which sat a little girl, her blue, anxious eyes fixed on the open door. "I hope he gets here before Dad," she said. "I wouldn't like Dad to come and find it not ready." The woman on the bed closed her eyes wearily. "I don't think he'll come now, dearie. We must just get on without it." The little girl sprang up, her pale cheek suddenly flushed. "Oh, listen!" she cried. "Something's coming." They listened in breathless silence while the sound of wheels came down the street towards the empty door. Then an old hand-cart appeared in the doorway, and behind it William in his strange attire, and Joan in her fairy-like white cloak, white dress, white socks and shoes, her bright curls clustered with gleaming fog jewels. The little girl clasped her hands. Her face broke into a rapt smile. Her blue eyes were like stars. Oh, oh, she cried, it's Father Christmas and a fairy. Without a word, William pushed the cart through the doorway into the room and began to remove its contents and place them on the table. First the jellies and trifles and blancmanges, then the meat pies, pastries, sausage rolls, sandwiches, biscuits and cakes, sugar-coated, cream interlayered, full of plums and nuts and fruit. William's mother had had wide experience and knew well what food most appealed to small boys and girls. Moreover, she had provided plentifully for her 20 guests. The little girl was past speech. The woman looked at them in dumb wonder. Then, "Why, you're the boy she was talking to," she said at last. "It's real kind of you. She was getting that upset. It'd have broke her heart if nothing had come, and I couldn't do nothing. It's real kind of you, sir." Her eyes were misty. Joan placed the last cake on the table, and William, who was rather warm after his exertions, removed his scarf. The child gave a little sobbing laugh. "Oh, isn't it lovely? I'm so happy. You're the funny boy, aren't you, dressed up as Father Christmas? Or did Father Christmas send you? Or were you Father Christmas all the time? May I kiss the fairy? Would she mind? She's so beautiful." Joan came forward and kissed her shyly, and the woman on the bed smiled unsteadily. "It's real kind of you both," she murmured again. Then the door opened, and the lord and master of the house entered after his 6 months' absence. He came in no sheepish hangdog fashion. He entered cheerily and boisterously, as any parent might on returning from a hard-earned holiday. "'Ello, missus! 'Ello, kid! 'Ello, what's all this here?" His eyes fell upon William. "'Ello, young gent! Happy Christmas!" William murmured politely. "Same to you and many of 'em. 'Ow are you, missus? Kid looked arter you all right?" "That's right. Oh, I say, where's the grub come from? Fair makes me mouth water. I haven't seen nothing like this, not for some time." There was a torrent of explanations, everyone talking at once. He gave a loud guffaw at the end. "Well, we're much obliged to this young gent and this little lady, and now we'll have a good old supper. This is all right, this is. Now, missus, you have a good feed. Now, before we begin, I say, 3 cheers for the young gent and little lady. Come on now. 'Ip, 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 hooray! Now, little lady, you come here. That's fine, that is. Now, who'll have a meat pie? Who's for a meat pie? Come on, missus, that's right. We'll all have meat pies. This here's something like Christmas, eh? We've not had a Christmas like this, not for many a long year. Now, hurry up, kid. Don't spend all your time larfin'. Now, ladies and gents, who's for a sausage roll? All of us? Come on, then. I mustn't eat too heavy or I won't be able to sing to you afterwards, will I? I've got some fine songs, young gent, and Kid here'll dance for you. She's a fine little dancer, she is. Now, come on, ladies and gents. Sandwiches? More pies? Come on." They laughed and chattered merrily. The woman sat up in bed, her eyes bright and her cheeks flushed. To William and Joan it was like some strange and wonderful dream. And at that precise moment Mrs. Brown had sunk down upon the nearest dining-room chair on the verge of tears, and 20 pairs of hungry, horrified eyes in 20 clean, staring, open-mouthed little faces surveyed the bare expanse of the dining-room table, and the cry that went up all round was, "Where's William?" And then, "Where's Joan?" They searched the house and garden and stable for them in vain. They sent the 20 enraged guests home, supperless and aggrieved. "Has William eaten all our suppers?" they said. "Where is he? Is he dead?" "People will never forget," wailed Mrs. Brown. "It's simply dreadful. And where is William?" They rang up police stations for miles around. "If they've eaten all that food, the 2 of them," said Mrs. Brown, almost distraught, "they'll die. They may be dying in some hospital now. And I do wish Mrs. Murford would stop ringing up about Sadie's cloak. I've told her it's not here." Meanwhile there was dancing and singing and games and cracker pulling in a small house in a back street not very far away. "I've never had such a lovely time in my life," gasped the kid breathlessly at the end of one of the many games into which William had initiated them. "I've never, never." "We won't forget you in a hurry, young man," her father added, "nor the little lady neither. We'll have many talks about this here." Joan was sitting on the bed, laughing and panting, her curls all disordered. "I wish," said William wistfully, "I wish you'd let me come with you when you go stealin' some day." "I'm not goin' stealin' no more, young gent," said his friend solemnly. "I got a job, a real steady job, bricklayin', and I'm going to stick to it." All good things must come to an end, and soon William donned his red dressing gown again, and Joan her borrowed cloak, and they helped to store the remnants of the feast in the larder. The remnants of the feast would provide the ex-burglar and his family with food for many days to come. Then they took the empty hand-cart, and after many fond farewells, set off homeward through the dark. Mr. Brown had come home and assumed charge of operations. Ethel was weeping on the sofa in the library. "Oh, dear little William," she sobbed, "I do wish I'd always been kind to him."
Mrs. Brown was reclining, pale and haggard, in the armchair. "There's the Roughborough Canal, John," she was saying weakly, "and Joan's mother will always say it was our fault. Oh, poor little William!" "It's a good 10 miles away," said her husband dryly. "I don't think even William—" He rang up fiercely. "Confound these brainless police! Hallo, any news? A boy and girl and supper for 20 can't disappear off the face of the earth. No, there had been no trouble at home. There probably will be when he turns up, but there was none before. If he wanted to run away, why would he burden himself with a supper for 20? Why— 1 minute!" The front door opened and Mrs. Brown ran into the hall. A well-known voice was heard speaking quickly and irritably. "I just went away, that's all. I just thought of something I wanted to do, that's all. Yes, I did take the supper. I just wanted it for something. It's a secret what I wanted it for. William," said Mr. Brown. Through the scenes that followed, William preserved a dignified silence, even to the point of refusing any explanation. Such explanation as there was filtered through from Joan's mother by means of the telephone. "It was all William's idea," Joan's mother said plaintively. "Joan would never have done anything if William hadn't practically made her. I expect she's caught her death of cold. She's in bed now." "Yes, so is William. I can't think what they wanted to take all the food for. And he was just a common man straight from prison. It's dreadful. I do hope they haven't picked up any awful language. Have you given Joan some quinine? Oh, Mrs. Murford's just rung to see if Sadie's cloak has turned up. Will you send it round? I feel so upset by it all. If it wasn't Christmas Eve—" The houses occupied by William's and Joan's families respectively were semi-detached, but William's and Joan's bedroom windows faced each other and there was only about 5 yards between them. There came to William's ears as he lay drowsily in bed the sound of a gentle rattle at the window. He got up and opened it. At the opposite window a little white-robed figure leant out, whose golden curls shone in the starlight. "William," she whispered, "I threw some beads to see if you were awake. Were your folks mad?" "Awful," said William laconically. "Mine were too. I didn't care, did you?" "No, I didn't. Not a bit. William, wasn't it fun? I wish it was just beginning again, don't you?" "Yes, I just do. I say, Joan, wasn't she a jolly little kid and didn't she dance fine?" "Yes." A pause, then. "William, you don't like her better'n me, do you?" William considered. "No, I don't," he said at last. A soft sigh of relief came through the darkness. "I'm so glad. Good night, William." "Good night," said William sleepily, drawing down his window as he spoke. End of chapter 14. William's Christmas Eve. Read by Barbara Bulkley of BigBible.org. End of More William.